The 20th century between emancipation and disemancipation, the childlike multitude, democracy, and the market. If, as we have seen, the emancipation movement triggered by the upheavals of the war and the revolution in Russia spurred a reaction in Italy, this was no isolated phenomenon. In Austria, Mises took a polemical stand against Kelsen. Unlike the great jurist, he felt rather ill at ease with the society of his time and mounted a ruthless indictment of the multi-party system. His polemic was especially targeted against the class parties, the destructiveness of the trade unions, and even the legal protection of labor and the legal regulation of working hours. While the latter measures were advocated by statist writers, they too ought to be counted as destructive policy, considering that they reduced the quantity of labor performed and the profit of the economic production process. The concern that the new political situation caused to the existing social order was such that, even in 1927, when the spectacle of the open and permanent terrorist dictatorship established by Mussolini was clear for all to see, Mises paid tribute to fascism for having saved European civilization, thus acquiring a merit that will live forever in history. Despite granting fascism such acknowledgement, this was still a liberal author who saw it only as a momentary remedy dictated by the emergency situation. He called for the foundations to be laid for a return to the golden age of the liberal regime and the market economy. 2. The fact remains that Mises's critique concerned the entire democracy that had sprung from the collapse of a liberal world that, throughout Europe, still bore notable traces of the ancien regime. The Austrian author took up the classical liberal tradition's denunciation of the ever childlike multitude. The great mass does not possess the ability to think logically. Most men do not have the capacity of the mind that is necessary to understand the rather complicated problems of social life. Even if, by adventure or miracle, they were able to rise to such a height, they would lack the firmness and strength of will necessary to place general and permanent interests above their own particular and momentary ones. The masses demonstrate their perennial political immaturity through their inclination towards socialism or political interventionism in the economic field, or even simply through their demand for a progressive income tax. In these same years, a protagonist of the conservative revolution in Germany, which preceded the advent of Nazism, thundered against fiscal Bolshevism, Steuerbolschewismus, with some variations. This is a theme we also find in Mises, though he, above all, followed the classical liberal tradition, which justifies discrimination based on property as an indispensable instrument to defend it from the deadly taxes, to which the destitute would inevitably have recourse once they had obtained or wrested access to political rights and representative bodies. Indeed, the Austrian author, citing Thiers and his polemic against progressive taxation, mounts a severe critique of democracy. He who stands up against the rich, he who in any way tries to arouse the resentment of the most disadvantaged, can count on a large following. Democracy merely creates the conditions for the unfurling of this spirit which is always and everywhere present in latent form. This is the reef against which all democratic states thus far have been shipwrecked. The democracy of our time is on the right path to follow their fate. Mises's mistrust or hostility towards universal suffrage is transparent. This was confirmed decades later, when he denounced what he saw as the basic contradiction of the welfare state. For Mises, the latter could be justified solely on the grounds that the wage earners lack the insight and the moral strength to provide spontaneously for their future, but it would not, then, be legitimate to make such ill-equipped people the country's arbiters. The state system of social security assumes the need to impose upon the wage earners a restriction concerning the spending of their total income, yet it is the wage earners themselves who ultimately decide on the structure of the state and on the formation of the government, called upon to remedy their childish imprudence. But is it not absurd to make those people supreme in the conduct of government who are manifestly in need of guardians? It hardly needs saying that this reasoning can be easily reversed. On the one hand, the classical liberal tradition, so dear to Mises, excludes the propertyless from political rights with the argument that they are ultimately minors. On the other hand, those who claim to be their self-appointed guardians deny these eternal children any assistance. But, despite appearances, there is complete coherence in the positions of both supporters and opponents of popular suffrage. If, in Robespierre, the theorization of the natural right to vote goes hand in hand with the affirmation of the right to life among his antagonists, the overcoming of property-based discrimination is suspected of favoring the legislative affirmation of the right to life through a redistribution of income. From distrust or hostility towards universal suffrage immediately springs the rejection of proportional representation. It is absurd to expect Parliament to be a reflection of the social stratification of the country in miniature. If democracy is not to be reduced to an ochlocracy, it must be ensured that it is primarily members of the upper social strata who provide the nation's best political heads that sit in the representative bodies, rather than the elements of lesser value and the trade union and peasant leaders who have stamped the mark of spiritual desert on the German and Slavic parliaments. Admittedly, the upper social strata constitute a minority, but their influence on men's minds is far greater than their numbers. If these classes were not present in the representative bodies in sufficient force, a contradiction would open up between the public opinion of the country and the opinion of the parliamentary bodies, fatal to the functioning of the latter. Thus, Mises calls for these bodies to reflect the hegemony that the upper social strata already exercise at the level of civil society and the distribution of wealth. Once again, the continuity with the classical liberal tradition is evident, and Mises in fact seems to look at the gentleman without profession, who plays a great role in the English Parliament as the figure worthiest of performing a political function. He explicitly holds up the Anglo-Saxon countries as a model, with particular reference to 19th century Britain. The parliamentary regime can only function when there are only two parties, and neither of these must express class interests, that is, have its point of reference in the organized movement of the lower classes. Starting from his distrust and hostility towards universal suffrage, Mises criticized not only proportional representation, but also the very idea of representation. The deputy represents me no more than the doctor who treats me or the cobbler who makes my shoes. But what about democracy itself? While at times the Austrian author does not hesitate to take explicit aim at democracy, he generally prefers to proceed in a more cautious way. Limiting himself to a radical reinterpretation of it, the market is the authentic and peaceful democracy in which every penny represents a vote, and every mandate can be revoked at any moment by the consumer, who is therefore the true master of production. There is no other democracy to be claimed beyond the market that exists already. If anything, it is the latter that needs protecting from a democracy that, based on universal suffrage, and even on proportional representation, inevitably ends up under the sway of the multitude's puerile and selfish tendency to interfere or intervene in the world of the economy, property, and the market. Critique and redefinition of democracy in Schumpeter. The theory of democracy as market leads us to another author of Austrian origin. It may first be interesting to note that Joseph Schumpeter similarly takes as his starting point the critique of suffrage as an inalienable subjective right. In reality, so-called universal suffrage applies only to persons above the age limit established by law. But then, why should other kinds of restriction not be lawful or justifiable? If persons below the age limit are not allowed to vote, we cannot call a nation undemocratic that for the same or analogous reasons excludes other people as well. Observe, it is not relevant whether we, the observers, admit the validity of those reasons or of the practical rules by which they are made to exclude portions of the population. All that matters is that the society in question admits it. Nor should it be objected that, while this may apply to exclusions on grounds of personal unfitness, e.g., age of discretion, it does not apply to wholesale exclusion on grounds that have nothing to do with the ability to make an intelligent use of the right to vote. For fitness is a matter of opinion and of degree. Its presence must be established by some set of rules. Without absurdity or insincerity, it is possible to hold that fitness is measured by one's ability to support oneself. As we can see, here re-emerge all the themes of the polemic against universal suffrage developed by the liberal tradition since constant. If an age limit can be set for the exercise of political rights, then the law can decide on other limitations and restrictions too. It follows that suffrage is a social function and not a subjective right. The Austrian-American sociologist insists that we do not define democracy by the extent of the franchise. Moreover, discrimination can never be entirely absent. For instance, the United States, and Schumpeter was writing in the 1940s, excludes Orientals from citizenship. In the southern part of the United States, Negroes are also often deprived of the vote. To equate the exclusion of minors on the one hand with that of blacks or Orientals on the other is in fact to take up the category of the eternal child, which Constant had used for wage earners, and to apply it, in the wake of Mill, to a minor race, with racist implications that hardly need underlining. In the years in which Schumpeter was writing, blacks were not only excluded from the franchise, but subjected to lynching for attempting to register on the electoral roll or for union activities. Similar observations apply to Orientals subjected to a discrimination not limited to the strictly political sphere. In the second half of the 19th century, the Chinese, having already been deprived of the possibility of testifying in trials involving whites, were also exposed to the threat of being lynched, and that is not to mention that this hatred against Orientals culminated in the course of World War II in a mass deportation of Japanese origin Americans, not motivated by reasons of military security alone. 15. Obviously, the permanent denial of political rights to a social class or ethnic group considered incapable of rising to the level of maturity and full capacity to understand and decide cannot plausibly be collapsed into the momentary exclusion of those who have not come of age, but are destined ultimately to obtain these same rights. To demonstrate that suffrage is a social function and not a subjective right, Schumpeter offers a further example, the exclusion of Jews from political rights in Hitler's Germany 16. This last example is doubly unfortunate. Firstly, because it does not draw on the category of the eternal child, lacking, to use Schumpeter's language, the ability to make an intelligent use of the right to vote. But quite another one, though the latter, too, refers in some way to the liberal tradition. This was the category of the foreigner who cannot be assimilated to the nation in which he lives, and thus, in times of war or acute conflicts, can be equated to an accomplice or agent of a foreign power, or to a pathogen that attacks and infects a healthy organism from the outside. The latter category is certainly not alien to the treatment reserved for blacks and Orientals in the United States, but it would above all become central and decisive in the history of anti-Semitism. However, this added example adduced by Schumpeter is disconcerting mainly for another reason, namely that it refers to the terrible condition of an ethnic group that was already under the sinister shadow of the final solution. Of course, our object of discussion here is not the great economist's own immediate political choices. Himself Jewish, he made his way to the United States already in 1932. The fact remains that, starting from his theoretical presuppositions, which are those of the classical liberal tradition, just as it is not possible to claim suffrage as an inalienable subjective right, so it is not possible to condemn disemancipation. That is, it provides no grounds to condemn either the process to the detriment of blacks and immigrants, as well as poor whites, which developed in the United States at the end of the 19th century, nor that which took place in the Third Reich to the detriment of the Jews. Indeed, in initiating their disemancipation with the Nuremberg laws, which deprived them of political rights and subjected them to a sort of apartheid, Hitler's Germany at times referred, through the mouths of its more moderate exponents, such as Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank, precisely to the discriminatory practices against blacks and Jews that were already in force in the United States. But let us see, in broad terms at least, how Schumpeter further makes the case for his reinterpretation of democracy. Given that it is impossible unequivocally to define either the people called upon to decide children, blacks, immigrants, Jews, etc. can be excluded, or the common good that should be the object of a supposed popular will, not only are interests different and conflicting, but the satisfaction of needs can also be defined in a different and conflicting way. It follows that democracy needs to be formulated in a new way, renouncing the old idea and claim of government by the people. This reformulation should instead understand democracy as a peaceful competition between different leaders or leaderships. In this sense, democracy is the political analog of the market, with the competition and plurality of choices that the latter entails. And yet, in particularly difficult moments, such competition and plurality can be suspended without the country, thereby ceasing to be democratic. In fact, democracies of all types recognize with practical unanimity that there are situations in which it is reasonable to abandon competitive and to adopt monopolistic leadership. In ancient Rome, a non-elective office conferring such a monopoly of leadership in emergencies was provided for by the Constitution. The incumbent was called Magister Populi, or dictator. Similar provisions are known to practically all constitutions, our own included. The President of the United States acquires in certain conditions a power that makes him to all intents and purposes a dictator in the Roman sense, however great the differences, are both in legal construction and in practical details. I have italicized the word reasonable to underline the fact that, after all the talk about the impossibility of defining in unequivocal terms a common good, which every normal person can be made to see by means of rational argument, here the category that was previously banished and mocked is effectively presupposed. Locke had justified the power to act according to discretion 20 emanating from the state of exception in the name of the public good and the benefit of the community. Just as the United States justified the suspension of constitutional liberties, for instance during World War I, in the name of public safety. This is also the substantial meaning of the adjective used by Schumpeter, who also ends up using the category of public good, so much so that the Austrian-American economist credits Ramsay MacDonald, who declared his government proud and jealous of, and prepared to maintain the empire, with having made a sacrifice in the national interest. Recourse to a category by stealth invariably entails its uncritical use, in order to deal with the state of exception constituted by the war. President Wilson established a sort of dictatorship, yet this could be considered reasonable only on condition that intervention in the gigantic bloodbath that was already underway is itself considered reasonable. That is in accordance with the interests of the country as a whole. So here, instead of solving the problems bound up with the theory of democracy, elitism further aggravates them. By reducing the role of the people to the choice of a leader or a group of leaders, it confers on the latter the power to invoke a state of exception, which not only entails very grave sacrifices for the citizens forced to, fight and die, but at the domestic level implies the recourse to dictatorship and the suspension of that competitive leadership, which is meant to console the people, having renounced the sovereignty attributed to it by classical democratic theory. Here, I have given the example of an international war, but perhaps even more significant is the case of a civil war or a situation of serious social political crisis that seems liable to provoke the state of exception. Again, in this case, the establishment of a dictatorship can appear reasonable only on condition that we presuppose the need to defend some common good. Schumpeter thus calls upon this category only at the very moment when its fraudulence is most blatant, given that society is now divided into antagonistic fractions. Moreover, if the existing authorities are able to invoke a state of exception in order to suspend the rules of the game, it is unclear why it cannot be invoked also by social classes or political organizations that are in opposition, having become unable to bear a bloody war or a crisis situation that involves the destitution or even starvation of a considerable mass of people. This highlights the basic limit of any definition of democracy based exclusively on respect for formal criteria and the rules of the game. Rather, the validity of these rules requires a minimum common denominator in a society, such that it can face possible external states of exception in a united way, and avoid the emergence of states of internal exception, that is, socio-political antagonism so acute as to cause an emergency situation. After all, as the authors who commit to a merely formal definition of democracy themselves recognize, such a situation ends up undermining or annulling the very rules of the game that are supposed to define the inalienable essence of the political regime in question. But the difficulties inherent in Schumpeter's theory are also apparent even if we focus exclusively on periods of normality. Within the democratic political market, Schumpeter tells us, on principle at least, everyone is free to compete for political leadership. If this is an absolutely necessary condition for us to be able to speak of a democracy, it would be alien to the United States, where, at the time, the great economist was writing. Blacks and Orientals were excluded from political citizenship, and therefore evidently did not have the possibility of competing for political leadership. Yet, if this condition can simply be circumvented, it is not clear in what sense a political market that excludes substantial social and ethnic groups a priori can be defined as free. But then, what exactly does it mean to say that, within the framework of the market democracy, on principle at least, everyone is free to compete for political leadership? The same objections that Schumpeter leveled with regard to the subject of an inalienable right to vote, that is, as envisaged by the classic demand for universal suffrage, can also be made to apply to this everyone. In both cases, children and other categories must be excluded, and the definition of the free political market encounters the same difficulties and uncertainties that the great Austrian-American economist underlines with respect to the definition of the people, from the joint stock company to the market. As well as reducing democracy to the market, Mises also criticized parties, especially socialist and communist ones. By taking as their point of reference one class in opposition to the others, they rejected the liberal doctrine of the solidarity of all interests and forget the fact that, above the different opinions, there must remain the firm conviction that there is, in the last analysis, an identity of intentions and desires, while the divergence concerns only the means of achieving the desired end. This is a bit like the theory of the common good that Schumpeter later attributed to the classical conception of democracy, thus demonstrating his rather precarious assumptions. In the years after World War I, this theory was instead upheld by fervent liberals or neoliberals in polemic against radical democratism. Interesting here is the fact that the reduction of democracy to the market could be arrived at by starting from different and even opposing assumptions. In reality, the theory dear to Schumpeter and Mises was a redefinition of democracy in the classical terms of the liberal tradition. One central thread of continuity is now clear: the denial that suffrage is an inalienable subjective right. Others can also be identified. According to Schumpeter, rather than referring to the will of the people, as in the classical conception of democracy, Parliament is instead to be understood as an organ of the state. As we have seen, in the British political tradition, representation is never based on individuals, but on communities and collective subjects to which is delegated the function of contributing, through their representatives, to a better balance of powers. In this sense, the upper and lower chambers are indeed organs of the state, and nothing more. For Schumpeter, as for Mises, Parliament does not so much express the will of the people as respond to the need, proper to any complex society, for a division of labor. It is interesting to note that, in addition to the representative regime, Size also speaks of representative work. Just as in the political world, the deputies, who come only from the circle of active citizens, represent in some way the whole nation, so in the economic world, with the roles reversed. The mass of active workers carries out work in representation of the whole nation, and each individual worker carries out his work in representation of the others. In this sense, in the social state, everything is representation. It takes place everywhere, in the private as well as in the public sphere. It is the mother of productive and commercial industry, as well as of liberal and political progress. I go even further, it merges with the very essence of social life. In Size's usage, the noun representation retains its link to the idea of fiction and theatrical performance. The editor of the French liberals' speeches rightly points out that, in Size, the idea of representation blends into the idea of the division of labor. Men represent each other to the extent that they exercise different activities from which a mutual utility arises. 26. The reading of the political community on the model of the market was not lacking in historical precedents. Alongside the division of labor, another category also taken from the world of economics has followed the history of the liberal tradition like a shadow, namely, the assimilation of society to the model of the joint stock company. According to Burke, certainly all men have equal rights, but even so, the dividend is shared in proportion to the capital put in by each. In turn, Sieyes points out that the real shareholders of the great social enterprise are the real active citizens, the real members of the association, while the rest, the non-proprietors, having paid in no capital, have no right to participate in the management of the joint stock company, and must therefore be only passive citizens. The socio-political significance of this metaphor is clear by now. It makes it possible to pay homage to the call for equality that emanated from the French Revolution, while simultaneously justifying the exclusion of the majority of the population from the circle of political rights. According to another devotee of the theory of the joint stock company, Justice Moser, in a sense, the German Burke the philosophical theories of the radical Enlightenment and the French revolutionaries, in substituting the concept of man for that of shareholder, had arbitrarily flattened and leveled the different contractual positions of the different members of society. 8. Likewise, the category political market again reduces the idea of equality to equality between producers or consumers of goods, in addition to producing a tendency to delegitimize property-based discrimination in the field of political rights. The call for equality that emanated from the French Revolution introduces an element of mismatch and tension between the political world and that realm of inequality that is the economic world, a delegitimation. Mismatch and tension that, thanks to the metaphor of the joint stock company or the market, can be eliminated or reabsorbed by reducing the citizen or man to the shareholder or consumer. The latter figure is much more expansive than that of the shareholder, and it is natural that it should take its place in a historical period characterized by universal suffrage or the generalized demand for it. And given the contemporary tendency towards the extreme personalization of power, soft Bonapartism, we can also understand that, while Size indicated a more or less narrow elite as the real subject of power, Schumpeter instead pointed to the more or less charismatic leader exercising a formative leadership of public opinion beyond the lines of party toward national leadership, located outside both party and parliament. Yet despite these differences, the central thread of continuity is fully apparent. An understanding of the political community exclusively in terms of the division of labor, on the model of a joint stock company or market, is what I have called repressive individualism. On this basis, in Size's era, the French bourgeoisie banned trade unions, which were deemed disruptive of the market and the division of labor. Similar accusations are echoed in our own time by a theorist of the democracy as market such as Mises. If Schumpeter reduces democracy to the simple choice between competing leaderships, Size asserts that the representative regime consists simply in the delegation of full powers to a representative elite that cannot be disturbed by petitions or pressure of any kind. This is also the opinion of the Austrian-American economist, according to whom there is no place for backseat driving a democratic society, as he characterizes it. On the contrary, such a society requires that people stand by patiently even while somebody is attacking their most vital interests or offending their most cherished ideals, 30 like the doctor. The cobbler or the engineer, parliamentarians and rulers must be able to do their work without being subjected to the pressures of the public square. To Schumpeter's eyes, the organized parties, if not trade unions, must be seen as a disturbing element in the quiet and orderly progress of the division of labor and the political market. But, of course, as even Adam Smith recognizes, to stifle workers' associations is to give clear favor to coalitions of employers, just as, we might add, to limit as much as possible or remove the space for organized parties is largely to silence the voice of the subaltern classes, to the advantage of the most powerful industrial and financial lobbies and groups. By flattening the political community into the joint stock company and entirely reducing it to a division of labor, Size fully legitimizes the distinction between active and passive citizens, while declaring unfounded the claim to a subjective right to suffrage. Similarly, Schumpeter, starting from the reduction of democracy to the market, justified the exclusion from political rights of blacks, Orientals, Jews, and this or that ethnic or social group. But today, At a time when it no longer seems possible openly to question the principle of universal suffrage, the redefinition and restriction of democracy are important above all from another point of view. Through the assimilation of the political community to a joint stock company or a market, the subaltern classes that aspire to see guarantees of the right to life and the dignity of a human existence are pushed back into the same world of commodity distribution that they had hoped to transcend. It should be added that the theory that condemns the classical conception of democracy as archaic and incompatible with the complexity of today's industrial society itself displays pre-modern propensities. We see this in a 1945 speech of Schumpeter's, consumed with anguish at social decomposition, the current disorganization, and the moral disorganization resulting from the utilitarian philosophy of the last century, based on individual egoism. He suggests as a remedy not only the corporatist principle and corporatist organization, but also a theory of leadership extending beyond the political sphere proper. According to Schumpeter, the cause of this tragic situation lay in the lack of conscious, recognized leaders in families, in factories, and societies. In particular, the business leader, far from rightly being considered an adversary or an enemy, as in Marx's theory of the class struggle, is essentially a worker who is the leader of other workers, and thus more properly compared to a military commander. Here we can note obvious pre-modern echoes, and nostalgia for a world without unions and class parties, a world, moreover, based on a fiduciary relationship between leaders and followers, in society as in the workplace. This speech is all the more remarkable considering that, although it was delivered in Montreal, it was given by an exile from Austria, which had now been swallowed up by the Third Reich. This country was thus now subject to a regime under which, with the elimination of the class struggle, the factories, too, were subject to the Führerprinzip, that is, the principle according to which the industrial manager was to be considered akin to a military leader, able to count on the trust and loyalty of his entourage. The emancipation process and the theorization of social and economic rights. World War II ended with a fresh expansion of democracy, and not only because of the collapse of fascist dictatorships. Women's suffrage triumphed in countries such as Italy and France, with the disappearance of the remaining traces of plural voting, equal universal suffrage, and the principle of one person. One vote also forcefully asserted themselves in Britain. In the United States, the discrimination against blacks and poor whites, introduced by the disemancipation movement at the end of the 19th century, began to be put into doubt. And the return to proportional representation in Italy further democratized the electoral and political system, blocking attempts to return to the regime of notables that had preceded World War I and the October Revolution. Not only did this period see the universalization of political rights, but they were also given material substance. The Constitution of the Italian Republic established a relationship between freedom and the removal of the obstacles of an economic or social nature that thwarted it or threatened to thwart it. In many countries, governments declared their intention to pursue a policy of full employment and social security for all. Even in the United States, where the laissez-faire tradition is more deeply rooted, Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke in 1940 of freedom from want as one of the essential and indeed inalienable democratic freedoms. The theorization of social and economic rights was enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. Commenting on the approval of this text, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had herself promoted it, declared that it should be accepted as the international Magna Carta for all mankind. To all this must be added the decolonization process, which had begun with World War I and the October Revolution, and was now gaining new momentum. This was the moment when the emancipation movement of the 20th century reached its highest point, having overcome the hurdle of fascism, and likewise surmounted the other resistance and counter-tendencies we have seen already. This is the context in which we should set the reflection of an author like Harold Lasky. If Schumpeter had found nothing to complain about in the exclusion of blacks from political rights in the southern states of the United States, the English liberal socialist denounced the fact that the 15th Amendment of the American Constitution, meant to prohibit racial discrimination in the exercise of political rights, continued to remain a dead letter, since neither the executive nor the Supreme Court were really willing to enforce it. But Lasky went further. Taking seriously the Rooseveltian watchword of freedom from want, he considered it intolerable that, in the United States, richer today than any country has ever been in history, a considerable proportion of citizens lived in poverty or on its margins. With reference to the Third World, he then pointed out that, in countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia so closely linked to the liberal West, one could speak of freedom only for a narrow circle, while the mass of the population endured conditions of life and work not very different from those of the slaves of ancient Greece or Rome. In any case, in examining the problem of freedom, one could not continue to separate economics and politics. In this same context should be placed the reflection that Norberto Bobbio developed in the 1950s and 1960s. It is interesting to observe how he engaged in his polemic with Palmiro Togliatti, while insisting rightly, and far-sightedly as is today clear, on the inalienability of formal freedom and its juridical institutional guarantees. The Turin philosopher also credited the socialist states with having initiated a new phase of civil progress in politically backward countries, introducing traditionally democratic institutions of formal democracy, such as universal suffrage and the electivity of offices, and of substantial democracy, such as the collectivization of the instruments of production. At this point in time, Bobbio's judgment on the political and social transformations that had taken place was so clearly positive and flattering that the new socialist state was called upon merely to transplant liberal, guarantee mechanisms into its own bosom, pouring a drop of oil into the machinery of the already accomplished revolution. 35. My concern here is not with his subsequent radical change of evaluation of the historical event that began with the October Revolution. What is more important is the fact that, at this point, a substantial democracy was also being theorized alongside formal democracy. In these years, the demand for a democracy with socioeconomic substance was so widespread that its effects were notable even in authors who sought to position themselves in line with the classical liberal tradition, and later even became points of reference for neoliberal literature. In 1948, such a figure as Karl Popper declared himself in favor of the aim of securing full employment at high wages for the whole laboring population in the open society and its enemies. We find a general consideration of the link between the formal and material dimensions of freedom. Even if the state protects its citizens from being bullied by physical violence, as it does, in principle, under the system of unrestrained capitalism, it may defeat our ends by its failure to protect them from the misuse of economic power. In such a state, the economically strong is still free to bully one who is economically weak, and to rob him of his freedom. Under these circumstances, unlimited economic freedom can be just as self-defeating as unlimited physical freedom, and economic power may be nearly as dangerous as physical violence. For those who possess a surplus of food can force those who are starving into a freely accepted servitude without using violence. The theorist of the open society has a nice way of classifying Marx among the false prophets, whether he is aware of it or not, directly or indirectly. Popper ends up deducing from the German philosopher the criticism of liberalism formulated in this text. There is not only physical coercion, there is also economic coercion that can reduce even legally free individuals to conditions of substantial servitude. In the first years following 1945, a demand for social and economic rights, proclaimed and enshrined even by the UN, seemed so irresistible that it was not so much openly opposed as stripped of its critical potential by means of a reassuring and sometimes even rose-tinted reading of the existing realities. Popper acknowledged the debt that the modern democracies owed to Marx as having been forced to take into account the relationship between politics and economics, and the fact that freedom also has a material dimension. But he did so only then to add that these democracies had made the Communist Manifesto obsolete, simply by putting most of its programmatic points into practice. In these years, we see a paradoxical phenomenon at work. The utopia denounced in Marx is contrasted with a sort of realized utopia. The political and social reality of the time is, in fact, seen and celebrated as a society that has not only fully realized, together with the other freedoms, also freedom from want, but is even characterized by the progressive disappearance of class privilege and, according to certain particularly apologetic descriptions, disappearance of social classes as such, equal to by the... This is how Dahrendorf, writing in the 1950s, summarized the goals now achieved by the capitalist system. Today, the allocation of social positions is increasingly the task of the educational system. Property had lost all importance, being replaced instead by merit. The school has become the first and thereby decisive point of social placement. And this is not enough. There is increasing equalization of the social status of incumbents of different social positions. And, as a tendency, the process of leveling social differences cannot be denied. The author of this rose-tinted picture is, moreover, forced to polemicize against other sociologists, according to whom there is now a spontaneous movement towards a situation in which there are no classes and no class conflicts, because there is simply nothing to quarrel about. There is no need to underline the radically erroneous character of such predictions, which sometimes even claim to be a simple recognition of fact. But we should not lose sight of the fact that such a reassuring picture of reality also expressed, albeit in a distorted and mystifying way, an awareness that, after the political upheavals of the 20th century, in a society characterized by a great development of the productive forces and of social wealth, it was no longer legitimate to restrict the meaning of freedom to its essential formal dimension. Even from this honeyed description of the existing reality, there emerges an objective recognition of the social and economic rights that seem to have become part of the common consciousness in these years. Hayek and the nostalgia for a world uncontaminated by universal suffrage. Like all the preceding moments in the expansion of democracy, the post-war period also saw manifestations of resistance and the emergence of efforts towards disemancipation, especially overtly expressed in an author like Hayek. It may be interesting to examine this neoliberal patriarch's rereading of contemporary history. According to Hayek, from 1848 onwards, social or totalitarian democracy began its baleful struggle against liberal democracy. In 1870, there were already clear signs of the decline of the tradition of liberty, which he instead intended to restore in its pure, authentic form. Especially interesting is this periodization, which connects the first manifestation of the crisis of liberalism to the first appearance of modern democracy. If 1848 marked the affirmation of universal male suffrage in France, the second date takes us to the years after the collapse of the Bonapartist dictatorship and the brief flare-up of the Paris Commune, and after the failure of attempts at both Bourbon restoration and disemancipation, through the return to open property-based discrimination or the introduction of plural voting. It was in these years that the Third Republic began to function as a parliamentary democracy based on universal male suffrage. These facts do not cause the least disturbance to Hayek, who does nothing to conceal his sovereign attitude of indifference or haughty disdain towards what is commonly called political freedom. The quotation marks are the neoliberal patriarch's own. By this he means the participation of men in the choice of their government, in the process of legislation, and in the control of administration. A free people in this sense is not necessarily a people of free men, nor need one share in this collective freedom to be free as an individual. That is, freedom taken in its most authentic meaning indeed, in the only one acceptable to the patriarch of neoliberalism. The autonomy and inviolability of the individual sphere does not necessarily need democracy, and the recognition of political rights for all. This is why Hayek has no problem in mounting a periodization that has the beginning of the crisis of the tradition of liberty coincide with the advent of mass suffrage. The extension of political rights has nothing to do. With liberty, it can scarcely be contended that resident aliens in the United States, or persons too young to be entitled to vote, do not enjoy full personal liberty because they do not share in political liberty. 43. Significantly, the examples given here, foreigners and minors, are the same ones constant resorts to in order to justify the exclusion of non-proprietors from political rights. No nation has regarded all the individuals living in its territory, in whatever way this might be, as members of the political association. Even the most full democracy excludes from political rights foreigners and those below the age decreed by the law. As Laboulaye emphasizes in a note, women must be added to children, that is, half of the nation. Universal suffrage is thus exercised only by a minority of citizens. This proves clearly that it is a political function and not a natural right. If women, not to mention children, can be excluded from political rights, why could not the propertyless be excluded too? Similarly, Hayek argues, it is useful to remember that in the oldest and most successful of European democracies, Switzerland women are still excluded from the vote, and apparently with the approval of the majority of them. It also seems possible that in primitive conditions, only a suffrage confined, say, to landowners would produce a legislature sufficiently independent of the government to exercise effective control over it. 5. We have seen Laboulaye make the case that suffrage is only a political function and certainly not a natural right. This is, once again, the opinion of the patriarch of neoliberalism. Hayek insists that the denial of political citizenship to certain social groups and, as we shall see, also ethnic groups, not only does not harm the freedom of those thus excluded, but also does not violate the principle of equality before the law. Thus, if in the Western world universal adult suffrage seems the best arrangement, this does not prove that it is required by some basic principle. However strong the general case for democracy understood as the recognition of political rights for all adults, it is not an ultimate or absolute value and must be judged by what it will achieve. It is probably the best method of achieving certain ends, but not an end in itself. By now it is clear. Hayek takes up the arguments with which the liberal tradition of the 19th century had justified property qualifications, as it resisted each step forward made by the suffrage movement, while also leaving the door open to further restriction through disemancipation measures. In the years of the July monarchy, in the country where memories still survived of the political rights enjoyed by almost the whole adult male population during the Jacobin phase of the Revolution, Thiers had stated, "We do not believe that one is an elector by right. One is an elector for the utility of the country. The only electors are those whom the country has believed to be useful and declares as such by a law." After Louis Napoleon reintroduced universal suffrage, in the more or less liberal phase of the Second Empire, Laboulaye insisted that neither in England, nor in America, nor in any other country in the world, Has the electoral right been supposed to be a natural right? This last peculiar idea had exclusively emerged in a country that was devastated by a ruinous revolutionary process. Hayek, in turn, after contrasting the Anglo-Saxon political tradition with the French one, at fault for favoring, from 1848 onwards, the inauspicious rise of social or totalitarian democracy, denounced the political regime dominant in the France of that time as a dictatorship of the ouvriers, indeed, an uncompromising aristocracy of the ouvrier. 4.9. This judgment, which Hayek himself fully embraced, was taken from an American author who had written these words in 1848. That was the year of the introduction of universal male suffrage, with the extension of political rights also to the workers whom the author denounced as a new privileged and tyrannical caste. He articulated this judgment in a paper republished in the 1960s in the New Individualist Review, the publication in which Milton Friedman, another illustrious name of the neoliberal current, also collaborated alongside. Hayek. The nostalgia which transpires from these pages for a world not yet contaminated by egalitarian mass suffrage is no merely individual weakness. Hayek steers well clear of questioning the restrictions based on property, culture, or race that had been in force in the United States when this 1848 text was written. Still, in 1975, there were those in that country who envisaged a fresh disemancipation to be achieved through the introduction of plural voting. As we can see, distrust or hostility towards equal universal suffrage died hard. The 19th and 20th century critique of democracy and its endpoint. Not only does Hayek take up the arguments developed by the classical liberal tradition in support of property-based discrimination regarding political rights, more precisely, he refers directly and explicitly to those late Victorian British authors who looked with horror at the expansion of suffrage that was then ongoing. This is the context in which we should see Hayek's positive statements regarding Lecky, an author who considered essential to British liberty the exclusion of non-taxpayers from political rights, and above all, the eminent thinker, or rather one of the greatest political thinkers of the 19th century, Lord Acton, who is repeatedly cited, and passages of whose are often used as an inscription for this or that text. And here we are dealing with an author who never tired of underlining the abominable results of universal suffrage, which everywhere proved absolutist and retrograde 52 given the associations of this tradition. It is easy to understand why Hayek would like to erase the term democracy and replace it with the less compromising isonomy. After emphasizing the full legitimacy of the property-based forms of discrimination dear to the liberal tradition, Hayek concludes, "It is also by no means obvious that proportional representation is better because it seems more democratic." A similar approach is taken by Schumpeter. While considering legitimate the exclusion of this or that ethnic or social group from political rights, he does not explicitly reject the principle of universal suffrage. Rather, he mounts an indictment of proportional representation, which he accuses of promoting instability by offering opportunities for all sorts of idiosyncrasies to assert themselves. Several have noted the debt that Schumpeter owed to Italian elitism and to authors such as Mosca and Pareto. As we have seen, the latter were critics of equal universal suffrage and proportional representation, moreover denouncing the latter as the electoral system that, by realizing equal universal suffrage in its most complete form, lays bare its subversive and catastrophic effects. The condemnation of proportional representation was the end point of the expressions of unease and criticism of democracy, in Italy as in Austria, after the enormous revolutionary upheavals that followed World War I. The Italian elitists, in turn, harked back to the lessons of authors such as Bryce and Ostrogorsky. Looking at the United States, they had engaged in inflamed denunciations of the deep damage caused by organized parties, which suffocated enlightened elites and vigorous personalities with a machine all the more ruinous the more it dragged behind it the muddy mass of blacks, immigrants, and illiterates. Unwisely admitted to the exercise of political rights and inclined to cause social and workplace unrest, in a certain sense taking its cue from reflection on America, where universal male suffrage was introduced first, albeit limited to the white community. Elitist theory returned with Schumpeter to its starting point, after having passed through Italy and Europe. Each stage in this bumpy journey was marked either by a disemancipation process or a project that pointed in that direction. In America at the end of the 19th century, the critique of democracy resulted in the explicit exclusion of blacks, immigrants, and poor whites from political rights, through the enactment of registration laws that hindered the lower classes' access to the ballot box. In Italy, after World War I, after a debate that contemplated the most diverse measures, on the eve of the establishment of the fascist dictatorship, which, with its brutality, would strip the previous debate between emancipation and disemancipation of all meaning, criticism of democracy flowed into denunciation of the proportional system, seeing as it was impossible directly to attack universal suffrage, by now too deeply rooted in people's conscience. On the wave of the conquest of universal suffrage, especially in the France of the Third Republic, the democratic and socialist movement had demanded the introduction of proportional representation. The condemnation of this electoral system would likewise lead to a more or less explicit critique of universal suffrage itself, after World War I and until the period following World War II. It is in this perspective that we should set the various reinterpretations of democracy and the representative regime as a political market, and as a procedural mechanism for the production of leaders, or as a simple isonomy. Not by chance, as in Mises. These took their cue from the debate that developed as a challenge to the emancipation process that had followed World War I and the October Revolution. Such reinterpretations which, by erasing the very idea of representation, constitute the most radical critique of the demand for proportional representation, not only expunge social and economic rights from the catalogue of rights, but also make democracy compatible with the exclusion of certain social and ethnic categories from political citizenship. In issuing their condemnation of proportional representation, both Schumpeter and Hayek cited the German-American scholar of electoral systems, Ferdinand Hermans. In his work, too, we can find a somewhat lukewarm or reserved attitude towards universal equal suffrage. The book in question is preceded by an introduction that credits the British and their incomparable practical sense for their maintenance of special seats in Parliament for the great universities. While this is not explicitly mentioned, it was an institution connected with plural voting for the benefit of both the universities and business centers that would endure until 1948. Moreover, the author of this introduction acknowledges that these seats are actually survivals of the corporate representation of medieval times, but insists that they serve a modern purpose. 7. Universal suffrage and social or totalitarian democracy. According to the patriarch of neoliberalism, the theorization of freedom from want and of social and economic rights was to be blamed on the ruinous contagion that had developed since the Marxist Russian Revolution, in fact. The claim to suffrage rights for the propertyless and those without financial means had gone hand in hand with the theorization of the right to life already in Robespierre. Subsequently, the revolution of, which sanctioned universal male suffrage, also saw the rise of the demand for the right to work. But it is correct that the development of this movement cannot be understood without the lesson of Marx. It is worth reflecting for a moment on the latter's fundamental critique of the bourgeois society that resulted from the French Revolution. It completed the transformation of the political into social estates, or changed the differences of a state of civil society into mere social differences, into differences of civil life, which are without significance in political life. Even in its most developed form, even where it removes property-based restrictions from the electoral law, the bourgeois state in fact merely closes its eyes and declares real contradictions to be non-political contradictions which do not disturb it. In this sense, to the extent that the rights of man regard the poverty, even desperate poverty, of broad masses of people to be a merely private matter, they are only formal in character. The theorization of freedom from want and of social and economic rights cannot be understood without Marx's lesson. This theorization would develop even in political circles very distant from Marx, in response to the challenge posed by the real movement, largely inspired by the authors of the Communist Manifesto and resulting in the October Revolution, as well as the hopes or illusions this revolution aroused among vast popular strata all over the world. In this sense, Hayek is right to connect the theorization of social and economic rights with a cultural and political tradition he considered odious. But insofar as he proceeds to deny these rights, the patriarch of neoliberalism is a theorist of disemancipation also in one further sense, namely that, even though he does not openly question universal suffrage also for reasons of political opportunism, he does somehow deny its legitimacy. For Hayek denounces universal suffrage as providing the foundation and the premise for despotic and liberticidal pretensions to realizing supposed social and economic rights, and so-called freedom from want. The path to the new serfdom and despotism is marked by increasing state interventionism and by the demand for a coercive redistribution of income, a pretension which itself results from the indiscriminate granting of political rights. At the time when the dependent and propertyless were growing most rapidly in numbers, they were also given the franchise, from which most of them had been excluded. The result was that in probably all countries of the West, the outlook of the great majority of the electorate came to be determined by the fact that they were in employed positions. Since it is now their opinion that largely governs policy, this produces measures that make the employed positions relatively more attractive and the independent ones ever less so. That the employed should thus use their political power is natural. The problem is whether it is in their long-term interest if society is thereby progressively turned into one great hierarchy of employment. Had not many liberal authors of the 18th and 19th centuries claimed that putting the right to vote in the hands of the unpropertied posed a grave danger to property? Did not Constant already denounce progressive taxation as a measure that was not only despotic, but turned the poor into a new privileged caste? Pursuing an even more vigorous offensive, Hayek insistently condemns progressive taxation as an attack not only on liberty, but also on equality before the law, since it discriminates against and penalizes the highest incomes. And, much like Constant, this latter-day neoliberal portrays this odious discrimination as the ruinous consequence of universal suffrage. Taxation comes to be based on a conception of income which is essentially that of the employee. The paternalistic provisions of the social services are tailored almost exclusively to his requirements. According to Hayek, now that the worker enjoys political rights, it is he who controls the legislature. The liberticidal pretension to impose social justice, and the pursuit of the mirage of social justice, can also be traced back, directly or indirectly, to universal suffrage, and the inevitable outcome of this ruinous course is social or totalitarian democracy. After reporting and embracing Mises's denunciation of the welfare state as guilty of granting political rights to minors in need of assistance, Hayek asserts that it is also possible for reasonable people to argue that it would be better if all recipients of public charity were excluded from the vote. Indeed, one can go much further. Even in the most democratic countries, the universal suffrage proclaimed in theory is denied in practice through the denial of voting rights to minors, criminals, foreigners, and so on, if only persons over 40, or only income earners, or only heads of households, or only literate persons were given the vote. This would scarcely be more of an infringement of the principle than the restrictions which are generally accepted. Even if this maximal objective was unachievable, what could be done was to redefine democracy, expunging any idea of an inalienable subjective right to suffrage, and even more so, of economic and social emancipation, disemancipation, and minimizing democracy, the case of Popper. But it is not only the authors I have just mentioned who work to redefine and reduce the scope of democracy. Here, I will limit myself to two examples that can give a sense of what today seems to be the main tendency. Popper's evolution is significant. The open society and its enemies is characterized by a basic contradiction. On the one hand, it establishes a link, as we have seen, between freedom and material rights, which have either been realized in practice or compel attention also thanks to the contribution of Marx and the movement that takes its cues from him. On the other hand, the definition of democracy is very formal. In the philosopher's subsequent evolution, the first consideration has been completely overshadowed and even erased by the second. It is the latter that we should now deal with. The theorist of the open society presents as a fundamental discovery in the field of political science the new approach, which compels us to recognize that the old question, who shall be the rulers, must be superseded by the more real one. How can we tame them? At the time the author published this book, and even more so at the moment of its conception, universal suffrage was far from well established worldwide, and not only because in many countries women continued to be excluded from political rights. In America, the laws that had sanctioned the disemancipation of blacks, immigrants, and poor whites had not yet been struck down. In Britain, the plural vote endured. Not to mention a country like South Africa where racial discrimination appeared in all its monstrosity, including with regard to the exercise of political rights. But the approach taken by the theorist of the open society effectively delegitimizes the fight for suffrage. Nevertheless, this alleged discovery would become the central or even only theme of the late Popper, who defines democracy as the type of government which can be removed without violence, or in which the government can be got rid of without bloodshed. In reality, these two definitions are not at all equivalent, and the thesis according to which the socio-political system dominant today in the West would allow a peaceful transition to a genuinely different one remains wholly unproven. But, leaving aside the variations and imprecision of language, the theorist of the open society means to say that a regime in which the change of parliamentary majority, of government and of governmental formulae takes place painlessly and in compliance with the rules of the game is to be considered democratic. This is, in substance, also the definition we shall see in Bobbio's more recent works. But it has one further aggravating factor, for while the Turin philosopher sometimes seems to include, among the conditions for a minimum definition of democracy, respect for the individual rights of all citizens, Popper's formulation is characterized by an even more radical formalism. In this reading, even a slave-owning country like the pre-1865 United States could come under the rubric of democracy. This was, after all, still a society in which one president succeeded another and one party alternated with the other in an orderly and peaceful fashion. And this is the only condition that the theorist of the open society establishes for distinguishing democracy from tyranny. 69 pushed to the extreme. The formalism of a definition based exclusively on the proper functioning of the rules of the game ends up by considering irrelevant not only citizens' political rights, let alone their material rights, but even their civil rights. It is no coincidence that Popper mounts an impassioned celebration of the Athenian democracy. Its mistakes and crimes, if there were any, lay in its foreign policy, but he forgets to mention that it was founded on the enslavement of the large majority of the population. We see what a remarkable trajectory the liberal tradition has followed in challenging the claim of the unpropertied to voting rights and political participation. Constant polemically pointed out that the Athenian democracy to which the Jacobins harked back was in fact founded on slavery. In our own time, driven by its thirst for self-celebration and desire to reject excessive material claims, this same tradition proceeds, with Popper, to a definition of democracy so formalistic that it can even embrace a regime of slave owners. However, even an author such as Hayek agrees with the formulation advanced by the theorist of the open society, though, as we have seen, he was also somewhat suspicious of the term democracy itself. Insofar as this category evokes the right of all citizens to participate in political life, it is doubtless a disturbing one for a nostalgic of a society not yet contaminated by universal suffrage. Yet this term can easily be accepted once it has been subjected to a redefinition that lends itself well to the relegitimation of even the most oligarchic liberal regimes in a democratic key. To grasp the full extent of Popper's evolution, however, let us turn back to the open society and its enemies, and, more particularly, to the pages which, in underscoring the link between freedom and the material conditions of life, deem the Communist Manifesto now obsolete because its demands have supposedly already been realized in the West. It is worth dwelling on one of these for a moment, namely what Popper describes as the call for a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Given that he is referring to the Communist Manifesto, we may presume that Popper actually means to refer to the stark progressive Steuer, the strongly progressive taxation which Marx and Engels called for. Such a demand is now superfluous, observes Popper, since it has already been largely put into practice in the modern democracies. But this progressive tax is itself condemned as a synonym of oppression and despotism, and indeed set in close relation with the advent of universal suffrage by Hayek. He does not, therefore, seem to consider irrelevant and misleading the old question, who shall be the rulers? That Popper attributes to the enemies of the open society. As we know, the patriarch of neoliberalism traced progressive taxation back to the nefarious influence of the Marxist Russian Revolution and, in the Reagan years, the United States wanted to erase this influence as much as possible. This offered an opportunity for Popper to revise his judgment on the obsolete character of certain programmatic demands, especially now that even the aim of securing full employment at high wages for the whole laboring population, an objective which he had in 1948 attributed to British social policy, had in the meantime been clearly set aside, first of all in the United States and Britain. Already some time earlier, having abandoned the fantastical predictions of the 1950s, Dahrendorf had noted that the United States was seeing an increase in the percentage of the poor in the brief period since then. The situation has worsened even further. But the theorist of the open society, rather than revise his judgment, prefers to rail against those intellectuals who still dare to adopt a critical attitude towards existing realities. But when the new well-being had only just been established and everything was going well in the West, a great racket started up, and intellectuals issued their curses on our wicked age, our society, our civilization, our beautiful world. But irresponsible intellectuals have managed to see only evil in our Western world. They wanted to be original and to say things that fly in the face of the evidence. And they succeeded in overturning not only the evidence, but the objective truth. But I do not mean to go on blaming intellectuals. I would like to ask them to accept their responsibility for mankind and for the truth. Our freedom allows them to say everything, even to insult the free world and to paint it as an evil world. Such language is symptomatic of the growing aggressiveness of the ongoing process of disemancipation, seemingly determined to break down the obstacles that stand in the way of its onward march. Disemancipation and minimizing democracy, the case of Bobbio. It may seem strange to put the recent works of Bobbio in this same context, but the object of concern here is not the Turin philosopher's own immediate political choices. Rather, I am interested in examining his recent evolution on a strictly theoretical level. According to the minimal definition of democracy that he proposed some years ago, this political regime presupposes that one decision-making power is attributed to a very high number of members of the group, or of the collectivity, and two decisions within the group or collectivity, and choices between real alternatives, are freely made on the basis of the fundamental rule of democracy, which is the rule of the majority. It is interesting to note that the first rule specified here does not in any way require that a majority of the members of a given group or collectivity, that is, of individuals who have reached the age of majority, be empowered to make decisions. According to Bobbio, the very high number required by the first condition cannot be quantified. It can only be said that a society in which adult male citizens have the right to vote is more democratic than one in which only property owners vote, and is less democratic than one in which women also have the right to vote. So, even the liberal societies of the 19th century in which only a minority, and even a small minority, decided for the electorate excluded not only women, but also unpropertied men are still to be considered democratic. Paradoxically, when Bobbio refers to the need for majority rule, this is applied within the group empowered to make decisions, not to the relationship between this group and the population as a whole. The field of application of what is defined as the fundamental rule of democracy is thus seriously and arbitrarily restricted. On this basis, it is no longer possible to distinguish between democracy and an oligarchy capable of perpetuating itself, respecting the rules of the game within its own ranks. The holes in such a minimum definition of democracy are clear to see. Why should those who are left excluded bow to the principle of majority rule, which is explicitly trampled upon by the minority that proclaims its lone right to decide? Is the possibility of participation not the preliminary foundational condition of the validity of the rules of the game? Why should the classes who are not admitted to political citizenship, the foreigners, according to Constant's definition, and who are subjected to a legislation that comes to them from outside, feel bound by the rules of a game that not only does not concern them but is based on their exclusion? Defending the full legitimacy and reasonableness of a regime in which 32 million men are governed by the vote of 240,000. Thiers rejected the accusation leveled by those who claimed that, given the restriction of suffrage, with the July monarchy, the aristocracy of the nobility had been replaced by the aristocracy of the bourgeoisie. At the level of the philosophy of history, if not of his immediate political choices, Bobbio agreed with the French premier rather than with his opponents. For, starting out from Bobbio's current positions, no objection of principle can be raised against the disemancipation that took place in the France of 1850 or the United States of the end of the 19th century. Without doubt, they each thereby became less democratic. But why should this backward step not be taken, as compelled by the conditions of the time, when the ground of democracy is not itself abandoned? Meanwhile, this reading delegitimizes the great milestones that mark the advent of modern democracy, starting with the Revolution of 1848. Based on Bobbio's approach, this revolution appears as a completely unjustified coup de force against a society that was itself democratic. This, even if this society was itself the product of an earlier coup de force, though surely one he would find it hard to justify, given that the Restoration France against which the July Revolution rose up was also democratic, albeit even less so, insofar as it had a far from homogeneous representative body operating on the basis of the majority principle. It could be objected that the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 were prompted by the decision to restrict constitutional freedoms that the dominant power had in each instance taken just beforehand. But, as we have seen, similar decisions characterize the history of all representative regimes in crisis situations. On the level of the reading of history, Bobbio does not succeed in effectively countering Hayek, and both seem far from the positions of the protagonists of the February Revolution who, in introducing universal suffrage, declared their intention to call all the people to the exercise of the supreme right of man, that of his sovereignty. In his insistence that suffrage is not a right but a simple function regulated by society, Hayek is merely reiterating a central theme of the liberal tradition. For all its talk of individualism and the overcoming of all forms of holism, this tradition still today often refuses to recognize suffrage as a subjective right. It instead presents it as a gracious concession to be bestowed according to circumstances, but always, in the words of an author dear to Hayek, on grounds of expediency, or, in other words, for the benefit of the state. It is this approach, energetically affirmed by the patriarch of neoliberalism, which the Bobbio of recent vintage proves unable to question or overcome, having clearly regressed with respect to the positions he had earlier expressed. On the one hand, the Turin philosopher articulates the thesis that democracy presupposes the overcoming of holistic conceptions of society and history, and the recognition of the individualist principle of one person, one vote. On the other hand, by subsuming under the category of minimal democracy even regimes in which the right of suffrage belongs to a small minority of the population, and in which the figure of the modern individual sometimes does not even exist. And, as we have seen, for a long time in England, only communities and guilds were entitled to the right of representation. Bobbio ends up theorizing a sort of holistic democracy, that is, a democracy that grants political rights exclusively on the basis of the holistic calculation of the benefit of the state, as interpreted by the restricted circles of the ruling class. Here we get a measure of Bobbio's involution, as compared with the positions he expressed in the 1950s. Then, he considered universal suffrage an integral part of formal democracy. though it did not exhaust the scope of democracy as such, given that he also theorized a substantial democracy. Certainly, even in recent times, Bobbio's immediate political positions have been clearly different from Hayek's. But the fact remains that, on the philosophical level, the renunciation of the category of substantial democracy is the analog of the neoliberal liquidation of social and economy rights. Equally, the expulsion of universal suffrage from formal democracy in its minimal definition is the analog of a vision that considers democracy compatible with the exclusion of vast social and ethnic groups from political citizenship. Indeed, based on this as minimum definition of democracy, it would be easy for this category to embrace even a regime which, after depriving a large part of its citizens of political rights, then ventures into economic and foreign policies which condemn them to death by starvation or to mass sacrifice in war, however unjust this might be. The weakness of the resistance to the disemancipation process. While the tendency towards disemancipation is clearly prevalent, it would be schematic and wrong to paint a picture of today's political theory that takes into account only this tendency. To give just one example, the evolution of Popper and Bobbio can be contrasted with that of Dahrendorf. Putting aside the reassuring picture of reality that he painted in the 1950s, Dahrendorf went on to denounce the poverty and unemployment extending even into the capitalist metropole as a threat, and even a nullification of civil rights. Equality before the law has little meaning if there is no universal suffrage and other opportunities for political participation. Opportunities for participation remain an empty promise if people do not have the social and economic position to benefit from that which laws and constitutions promise them. Little by little, the idea of citizenship has been given substance. From being a formal quantity of rights, citizenship has become a status which includes, in addition to the right to vote, a decent income and the right to lead a civilized life, even when one is ill or old or unemployed. 80. Here, not only universal suffrage but also social and economic rights make up part of the definition of democracy. Abandoned by Bobbio, the category of substantial democracy ends up re-emerging in this passage of Dahrendorf's, even with regard to the terminology he uses. And yet, even in this case, the resistance to the disemancipation movement is weak and contradictory. Moreover, these comments show no awareness of this movement and remain subordinate to the reading of history developed by its leading theorists. For Dahrendorf, the category of citizenship also includes material rights, the theorization of which, according to Hayek, is to be blamed on the political tradition that resulted in the October Revolution and paved the way for totalitarianism. Yet Dahrendorf formulates only weak reservations concerning the patriarch of neoliberalism. The Anglo-German sociologist does not even seem to be fully aware of the debt that his most recent theoretical elaboration owes to Marx, nor does he seem willing to revise, as would be necessary, the commonly traced history of democracy. If, in its fullest meaning, democracy implies universal suffrage and social and economic rights, then, in the first place, it refers to the tradition that leads from the Jacobin French Revolution to the October Revolution, rather than to the blessed if not altogether perfect island, that is to say, to Britain. As we have seen, the latter, in fact, arrived only with considerable historical delay at the idea of modern representation and the principle of one person, one vote. Alongside the classic homeland of the liberal tradition, he refers with great warmth to Edmund Burke, the implacable enemy of the rights of man and of the swinish multitude, who subsumes the wage worker under the category of instrumentum vocale dear to the ancient theorists of slavery. Dahrendorf nonetheless celebrates him as the first theorist of the open society, in opposition to the totalitarian tendencies already emerging from France in 1789. The reference to the author of the first great indictment against the French Revolution delegitimizes that political tradition from which sprang the idea of citizenship given substance that Dahrendorf wants to affirm and defend today, but which Hayek considered ruinous. The latter, after paying homage to the great seer Burke, contrasts the Anglo-Saxon political tradition with the French one, which he indicts for its totalitarian tendency to theorize a social democracy that Dahrendorf, too, would today seem to have taken to heart. Dahrendorf also expresses his admiration for the more recent works of the theorist of the open society. But, when he realistically and critically analyzes the worsening social question in the West, he objectively ends up being one of those intellectuals of whom the late Popper loves to stand in condemnation. We are thus in the presence of a variegated and contradictory scenario. Yet the main tendency, in a process which is still underway, is the theoretical downsizing of democracy. Since democracy is not fulfilling its promises, in terms of either material rights or citizens' participation in political choices, a minimalist redefinition of democracy is being advanced in order to adapt it to the existing situation. In the last analysis, this is how the liberal or liberal democratic theorists of our century have generally behaved. And this is how Bobbio and Popper are proceeding today, the former in pained fashion, the latter with the magniloquence of a judge delivering his verdict. Disemancipation and the New World Order. But the terrain on which the disemancipation process does not seem to encounter any resistance worthy of note is the level of international relations. Indeed, the process being discussed here cannot be examined in exclusively national terms or limited within the bounds of the West. Such a picture would be not only incomplete but also distorted. After all, as we have seen, historically the emancipation process that developed in the context of a determinate state, national or ethnic community has often been intertwined with the disemancipation and even enslavement of ethnic groups and populations located outside that community. In the years of the colonial expansion of Europe and the West, the deracialization process that had developed in the capitalist metropole, to the benefit of those previously excluded from citizenship and considered foreigners and members of a different and inferior people, became deeply intertwined with another process that heavily naturalized the cultural diversity of the peoples subjugated or destined to be subjugated, transforming them into minor and barbaric races, thus summoned to meekly bow to what John Stuart Mill explicitly called the pedagogical despotism of their tutors. From this point of view, the 20th century represented a crucial turning point. For, starting from the appeal that the October Revolution launched to the slaves of the colonies, calling on them to break their chains, a powerful decolonization process developed which pitched into crisis the previous interconnection between emancipation within a determinate state, national or ethnic community, and disemancipation outside it. So, how should we fit together the pieces of today's situation? After the Gulf War and the collapse in Eastern Europe, the system of international relations seems to oscillate between two different temptations. The first is what we might call a planetary Bonapartism. At present, the conditions for this seem to be in place. The extreme concentration of the means of information that guarantees within the individual capitalist countries a monopoly to the trumpets of the bourgeoisie is even more accentuated in the relationship between, on the one hand, the former colonial powers, and even more so the sole surviving superpower, and, on the other, the countries of the Third World. The news market is the quasi-monopoly of four agencies: Associated Press and United Press's United States, Reuters Britain, and Agence France Presse. All radio, all television chains, all newspapers in the world subscribe to these agencies. 65% of the world's news originates in the United States. 85. The disappearance or extreme weakening of international organizations such as COMCON and the non-aligned countries is the equivalent of the phenomenon at the level of individual states that has led or is leading to the liquidation or marginalization of organized mass parties based on political programs. No longer hindered by these annoying filters and availing himself of the monopoly of the means of information, Bush presented himself as what the compliant press called the president of the planet. Having obtained formal plebiscitary investiture from the United States, Bush was able to proceed without any kind of hindrance in defining the timing, modes, and objectives of the war he so determinedly sought. In this context, we can well understand the United States' annoyance at the International Court of Justice. This country had already dismissed the court's legitimacy when it condemned it for having mined the ports of Sandinista-ruled Nicaragua, and it also bypassed it during the recent crisis with Gaddafi, in which Bush was determined not to wait for, and indeed to ignore the sentence of the International Court in The Hague and escalate the confrontation with Libya, even if the court ultimately ruled in the United States' favor. The fact remains that this is a body that reduces the speed and fullness of powers of the global executive. Most importantly, it puts up obstacles to the United States' direct and immediate relationship with the massive third world countries, which are atomized and in a condition of clear inferiority and subalternity, both at the level of their economies and in terms of information. It is true that military expeditions in the former colonies are today carried out in the name of the New World Order. But it is worth remembering that the establishment of peace and the passage from the state of nature to the social state with the legal regulation, if not of international relations as such, at least of those relating to Europe and to truly civilized countries, is another old theme of Bonapartist propaganda. 8. In its time, it managed to deceive a vast public opinion, and even, for example, in 1811, on the occasion of the invasion of Russia, great intellectuals such as Johannes von Mull and Goethe, who saw in that event the beginning of the realization of the beautiful dream of perpetual peace. Partly an alternative to the tendency towards planetary Bonapartism, but also partly bound up with it, is the drive to definitively transform the United Nations into an explicit instrument of the hegemony of the rich countries. In the years in which the influence of the Third World, accounting for the overwhelming majority of the world's population, was making itself felt in this organization, there was no lack of voices in the United States calling for a reform that would in some way guarantee power of control to the states that made the largest financial contributions. These calls and aspirations sometimes expressed a project of disemancipation, which would even be formalized through the enshrining in the sphere of international relations of the principle dear to the liberal tradition. whereby representation is primarily or exclusively the prerogative of those who pay the highest taxes. In his day, Churchill stated that the government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations who wished nothing more for themselves than what they had. If the world government were in the hands of hungry nations, there would always be danger. So, we can understand the current tendency to turn the Security Council into a club of rich countries, one to which Germany, Japan, or a body like the European Economic Community would indeed like to be admitted. 90. Discrimination based on property is, moreover, already being felt today, at different levels and in different areas. When it comes to voting in the Security Council or the UN General Assembly, the poorest and most populous countries are exposed to the sometimes explicit blackmail of the richest. Not long ago, we could read in the press that China has opposed sanctions against Libya, and the three Western powers have threatened commercial reprisals. And of course, the countries weaker and poorer than China are even more disarmed to resist the pressures of the rich and powerful. But this property-based discrimination also plays a significant role in other areas. Take the issue of armaments, not only nuclear weapons, but also chemical weapons, long and medium-range missiles, supercannons, and so on. All of these must be kept out of the hands of small and poor countries and remain the monopoly of the great powers, apart from some possible exceptions decided or allowed by them. This, even though the latter do not even feel obliged to commit to never making first use of weapons of mass extermination, which must be banned even at the planning stage when it comes to the small and poor countries. All this is somehow reminiscent of the exclusion of passive citizens from the National Guard. The monopoly of armed force that the bourgeoisie sought to establish at the national level after the French Revolution is today the objective of the club of rich countries at the international level. It barely needs adding that this monopoly is also the rule when it comes to deciding the direction of the so-called International Police Corps. If some obstacles do still stand in the way of the full development of this discrimination based on the various states' wealth, they would appear to be nothing more than the residue of a very particular historical constellation, the considerable weight and prestige of the USSR at the end of World War II, and the unforeseen victory of the revolution in China, and by now consigned to the past. Founded at the moment when the process of decolonization and emancipation at the international level began to develop following the defeat of fascism. The United Nations Charter stipulates the sovereign equality of all its members. Art. 2.I. This declaration of principle has never reflected the reality, yet it has played an important positive role in promoting the overcoming or questioning of the international relations handed down as the legacy of colonialism, including relations of political inequality. Today, there are many signs that the trend has reversed. The delegitimation of the International Court of Justice, the U.S. assertion of its right to capture and try a head of state, Manuel Noriega, who was first pampered and financed and then disgraced, and the reaffirmation of the Monroe Doctrine in its most brutal form. Upon Bush's trip to Moscow in the summer of 1991, one newspaper reported, on Castro, the president was very explicit. We have discussed it repeatedly. His presence 80 miles off our coast is intolerable. All this seems aimed at formalizing the inequality between great powers and small countries. This is also the context in which we should place the ongoing rehabilitation of colonialism. After the triumphant war against Iraq, in Francia professor Georges Boudarel was exposed to public shame for having opposed the French war in Indochina. His persecutors, among them a former minister of Giscard d'Estaing's, were all the more emboldened by the fact that they declared, "Public opinion today is rediscovering the civilizing role of the French army." It is easy to understand, then, that the revelations about the central role that oil played, as we shall see, in the crusade against Iraq, or about the American determination to exterminate the already unarmed and fleeing Iraqis, do not stir particular emotions. In this context, we witness the disconcerting fact that a philosopher like Bobbio, who kept his silence over the invasions of Grenada and Panama, the mining of Nicaraguan ports, and even the crimes that the West's then proxy Saddam Hussein committed during the war of aggression against Iran, wanted to give his backing to the expedition against Iraq only to continue to remain silent, for example, on the U.S. administration's repeatedly claimed right to liberate Cuba. In the meantime, imposing, outside the UN, a deadly blockade that indiscriminately strikes at that country's civilian population. The inequality of treatment in international relations between rich and powerful and poor and weak countries does not seem to distress today's theorists of democracy, not even the most tormented consciences. Colonial ideology, old and new. However, this inequality is explicitly theorized by Popper. In 2 revealing interviews, the theorist of the Open Society declared, "We must not be afraid to wage wars for peace. In the present circumstances, it is inevitable. And, sad, but we must do it if we want to save the world." But who is this we to whom Popper refers? The crusade is to be declared in the name of civilized states, that is, states of the civilized world. And which states are these? He clearly means the West, whose geographic and political boundaries are not specified, but which makes the sovereign decision as to who is civilized and who is not. Is this not the ideology that has traditionally accompanied colonial and imperial expansionism, one founded on the assumption of the primacy of the great civilized powers and the mission incumbent upon them? The theorist of the open society does not shy away from this ideology. He is just as fearless in rereading history as he is in demanding the deployment of armed force. To Popper's eyes, colonialism clearly and unequivocally represented progress. But what about the devastation and massacres that the colonial conquest brought? What about the extermination of the lower races, which was denounced at the beginning of the 20th century by a liberal, albeit a left-wing one, like Hobson? For Popper, all this is non-existent or irrelevant. Indeed, he does not hesitate to increase the dose. He insists that we liberated these states, the ex-colonies, too hurriedly and too simplistically, and that this was like abandoning a kindergarten to itself. Here, we are confronted with an explicit disemancipation. At the level of international relations, Popper would like to make the ex-colonial peoples regress to a condition of subalternity, rolling back the emancipation process which, starting from World War I and the October Revolution, led them to shake off the yoke imposed by the great powers. Here, we get back to the language of the golden age of colonialism, when whole races, to quote Mill, were considered minors, or as Kipling had it, half children and half devils. We find a similar reasoning in the theorist of the open society. For Popper, insofar as the countries and peoples of the Third World prove to be rebels and devils, civilized countries have the right and the duty to launch a crusade against them in the name of civilization and peace, or what he calls the Pax Civilitatis. Here, again, we come across a classic theme of colonial ideology. It was Theodore Roosevelt, this is herald of modern American militarism and imperialism, and even, to some degree, of racism, who claimed an international police power for the United States and the great powers of civilized society. The leader of a great power, Roosevelt explicitly arrogated to himself the right, in his role as guardian of order in the Western Hemisphere, to use a big stick against the recalcitrant peoples and countries of Latin America. Those who believe that the watchword of international police power is something new would do well to read the entire chapter, devoted to this theme as part of a brilliant overall analysis of the ideology of nationalist expansionism in American history. And if we turn from the United States to Britain, we see talk of world government coming from such a passionate champion of the British Empire as Winston Churchill, who, as we know, claimed such a government for the satisfied nations, the great powers who had been the protagonists of colonial expansion. Lastly, it should be remembered that a brutal, massacre-strewn colonial enterprise, like the great powers' joint expedition to suppress the Boxer Rebellion in China, was, in its time, celebrated, as Lenin noted and denounced, as the realization of the dream of idealist politicians, a United States of the civilized world. Colonial expansion constantly brandished not only the watchword of international police power, but also the slogan of peace. We find this in a champion of imperialism like Cecil Rhodes, and so too in Mill. The latter celebrated the British Empire as a step, as far as it goes, toward universal peace and general friendly cooperation among nations. However, despite the good intentions it cites as its inspiration, this ideology immediately reveals itself to be an instrument of war, since a vigorous despotism is the only method capable of raising backward peoples 101, or rather, barbarians. To a higher level, it turns out that colonial conquests and wars are in the interest of peace and civilization, and must therefore be extended to embrace the entire globe. It is already a common condition for the more backward populations to be held in direct subjection by the more advanced, and this is to become the universal condition. 1 and 2. The correspondence of today's realities with the colonial ideology of the pacifying mission civilizatrice, or rather the celebration so dear to Kipling, of the white man's or Westerner's burden, clearly transpires from the day-to-day news coverage on the conduct of the great powers. We read that, in the new design of the zones of influence in the world, the USA wants, at least from the commercial point of view, Latin America to belong to it, and that Somalia should be able to remain largely within Italy's sphere of influence. 103. No doubt. But what methods are being used to achieve an objective that is not the altruistic and disinterested one of which colonial ideology, both old and new, likes to boast? The only two great powers, the United States and France, that today exercise a direct influence on that continent, are now competing for that market, even at the cost of increasing the conflicts between the warring factions in various countries, supporting one or the other of these factions, depending on whether they are considered better suited to looking after their respective interests. This is the case in Liberia, where war rages between the factions allied to the incumbent President Charles Taylor and his opponents. 104. So, before they invest themselves with the role and mission of firemen at the service of the New World Order, the great powers behave like unscrupulous arsonists. Let us continue to leaf through news organs that can hardly be suspected of third worldist leanings. The New Yorker magazine reports on a 1986 mission by George Bush, who allegedly asked King Hussein of Jordan and Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak to put pressure on Saddam to intensify the bombing of Iran. The plan's objective was to force Tehran to turn to the United States for missiles and anti-aircraft defense weapons. In exchange, Washington supposedly requested the liberation of the American hostages in Lebanon. Barely touched on here is an argument that would deserve probing much more deeply. Presenting themselves as guarantors of world peace are the great powers that make enormous profits from the arms market, just as those who organize humanitarian missions by sending food and medicine are those who claim the right to impose, sometimes with an avowedly hegemonic intent, a total embargo on this or that rebel country in the Third World. Meanwhile, the official journal of the U.S. Army War College is already predicting the Second Gulf War 106, the return of foreigners and the future of democracy. For this reason, too, it is impossible to agree with the assessment of those who see in the collapse of the Eastern Bloc simply the fall of the old regime or the triumph of the demands for traditional civil and political liberties, and thus celebrate these outcomes. This view undoubtedly captures an essential aspect of the reality. Certainly, there was no possibility of survival for regimes which, by eternalizing the state of exception, were unable to achieve normality and ended up reproducing the figure of the childlike multitude guided by an elite claiming to be enlightened. But we should not overlook certain other factors that are also essential. Firstly, the collapse in the East seems to be fueling the disemancipation process to the detriment of the former colonial peoples. When Fidel Castro declared that the disappearance of the USSR is a tragedy for the Third World, he seems to have expressed an opinion and a feeling widespread in the countries forced to suffer the arrogance of the great powers. 108. Even leaving aside questions of international relations, we cannot overlook the fact that in Eastern Europe, we are witnessing the explicit removal from the catalogue of rights of those social and economic rights that Hayek, today the prophet of the regimes that have taken the place of actually existing socialism, blames not by chance on the October Revolution. Thus, emancipation and disemancipation are closely intertwined. This becomes even clearer when we reflect on the fact that those stripped of the right to life or freedom from want in Eastern Europe in today's Russia, more than half the population is below the poverty line and thus forced to emigrate. Upon reaching their destination, countries lose their political rights and sometimes face threats even to their civil rights. 109. The figure of the foreigner in constant, a metaphor to define the juridical situation of non-property owners deprived of political rights, is beginning to become a substantial reality also in Western Europe, as it has always been in America. Fleeing from a third world now lacking even the hope of development, or from former socialist countries that, instead of reaching the level of the more advanced Western countries, as hoped, risk regressing to underdevelopment. Masses of immigrants are pressing the borders of the European economic community, often succeeding by adventurous means to cross them, and thus constitute the class of foreigners. Here, too, the American model has won, or is winning. And, once again, a racialization process is underway that confines newcomers to the lowest-ranking segments of the labor market and tends to externalize social conflict, identifying in immigrants an external pathogenic agent and perhaps a scapegoat for unresolved or worsening problems. The people excluded from democracy and the guarantees of the rules of the game at the level of international relations suffer a similar violation of rights when they arrive in the capitalist metropole. There is evidently a relationship between the casting of formerly colonial countries as kindergartens, or, worse, as a jumble of barbarians outside the civilized world, deserving, if necessary, to be hit by the punitive expeditions of the great powers and the racist agitation developing in the capitalist metropoles. This agitation, too, considers non-Europeans unworthy of the rights due to other men, and sometimes hits them with beatings and punitive expeditions, reproducing in miniature the ones organized by the countries that claim international police power for themselves. No one willing to look reality in the face can fail to notice that skinheads basically radicalize the discourse dear to Popper and all those others who, regretting the overly hurried end of colonial domination, justify and welcome the ongoing recolonization of the Third World. Even in the second half of the 19th century, the ideology of the white man's burden or mission accompanied both the great powers' gunboat diplomacy and the lynchings of blacks or Orientals by the Ku Klux Klan and other racist groups. 110. But the foreigners of the developed capitalist world are not only the immigrants living within its borders, but all those who help produce its material wealth without being able to influence its choices. At the beginning of the 20th century, British liberal critics of imperialism provided some elements of a history of the figure of the foreigner on which it is still worth reflecting. For centuries, the West had engaged in raiding backward countries for servile or semi-servile labor power, first black slaves, then Chinese or Indian coolies. In ancient times, the employer would not, if he could, go away from his own country to employ Libyans or Scythians in their native places. If he left home, it was not so easy to come back. He was practically in exile. In the second place, he was not sufficiently master of his slaves in their own country. If they were all of one nation and all at home, they might rebel or break loose. But then, as a result of the development of both industry and the means of communication, it was no longer necessary to deport the indigenous labor force to the heart of the capitalist metropole, since it could instead be employed in the exploitation of local raw materials. The figure of the foreigner living in the capitalist world did not disappear, but it took a back seat to that of the foreigner living outside it. Certainly, since the time when this analysis was elaborated, colossal upheavals have taken place, changing the face of the earth. Especially starting with World War I and the October Revolution, these largely swept away, together with colonialism, at least in its classical form, also those forms of servile labor which Hobson noted, still endured at the beginning of the 20th century. Yet there are also elements of continuity. The English liberal published the first edition of his book in 1902. Little over 10 years later, through an agreement with the crisis-ridden Ottoman Empire, the British Empire created the state or protectorate of Kuwait. It absolutely needed this latter's oil for its vast program of naval rearmament, in the context of its growing rivalry with Wilhelm II's German Empire, which would soon give rise to World War I. 112. Let us now take a leap forward to the present. During the Republican convention in Houston, immediately preceding the 1992 presidential election campaign, Bush did nothing to hide the fact that Operation Desert Storm was necessary to prevent our energy sources being taken hostage. On the other hand, even newspapers who had been in the forefront of the crusade against Iraq let slip the real objectives of the Gulf War. The decision to severely punish Saddam Hussein had been taken by all the industrial powers firmly determined to keep the price of oil low, destroying any possibility of another oil crisis that would have slowed down 113. The expansive momentum of Western capitalism. At this point, we may recall an observation of Hobson's. The most profitable use of the hired labor of inferior races is to employ them in developing the resources of their own lands under white control for white men's profit. The oil needed by the capitalist West is extracted by workers who are foreigners twice over. For not only can they not influence the political destiny of the countries that are the prime beneficiaries of this essential raw material, they are also foreigners in the Sheikh's Kuwait, which continues to exclude them from political rights. Moreover, the link between internal foreigners and the others external to the capitalist metropole arises also from a classic of neoliberalism. In proceeding with his work of demythologizing universal suffrage, and in any case, questioning whether the vote is an inalienable subjective right, Hayek observes that everyone considers reasonable the exclusion from political rights of resident foreigners and inhabitants of special regions or territories. This last expression seems to allude to the situation of Puerto Rico, whose inhabitants are American citizens but do not have the right to vote in U.S. elections. Of the utmost interest here is the juxtaposition between foreigners proper and the population of a Caribbean island that was subjugated by the United States after the war with Spain, and is still today kept in a semi-colonial condition. The exclusion of the Puerto Rican population from political rights is no problem for the patriarch of neoliberalism, who instead uses this example to demonstrate that there should be no cause for scandal if those whom the classical liberal tradition assimilated to foreigners the destitute, the illiterate, and recipients of public charity were deprived of political citizenship. In 1926, after the gigantic process of emancipation and extension of suffrage that followed the war and the October Revolution, a great reactionary political scientist, Carl Schmitt, wryly observed that, in the British Empire, so-called universal suffrage concerned only 100 million of the total 400 million inhabitants. When one speaks of British democracy, of universal rights of suffrage and universal equality, one coolly overlooks these hundreds of millions, just as coolly as slaves were overlooked in Athenian democracy. Modern imperialism has put into practice new forms of domination, corresponding to economic and technical development which extend to the same degree as democracy develops in the motherland. Protectorates, mandates, treaties of intervention, and similar forms of dependence now make it possible for a democracy to dominate a population that is heterogeneous to it, without making citizens of it, to make it dependent on the democratic state, while keeping it distant from this state. In this sense, the gore of the foreigner is here, considered essential to democracy and inseparable from it. But had not the October Revolution promoted and ordained the revolt of the colonial slaves and sanctioned the conquest of human dignity by the barbarians alien to the West? Had it not thus proclaimed the end of the gore of the racialized foreigner? But let us see Schmidt's reply. In general, a democracy always includes slaves, that is to say, men who are deprived of rights in whole or in part and excluded from the exercise of political power, whether they are called barbarians, uncivilized, atheists, aristocrats, or counter-revolutionaries. 117. Clearly, the category of those excluded from democracy is too broad here, since it coolly amalgamates gores as diverse as, for example, slaves in the colonies and aristocrats during the French Revolution who were momentarily deprived of political rights. It should be added that the great political scientist then greeted Nazism's rise to power. So, having started by Camus aged within unmasking the or semi-slavery democracies. He then adhered to a regime that explicitly set out to subject to slavery the lower races and subhumans of Eastern Europe. In this sense, in the words of the young Marx, with the reactionary critique of ideology, the false flowers have been plucked from the chains in order to wear real chains without any flowers. But this is not a reason to ignore the theoretical challenge that comes from Schmitt. Notwithstanding the enormous changes that have taken place, we may well wonder whether Western democracy's self-exaltation does not somehow continue to bear an illusion similar to that of Tocqueville, who believed that property qualifications had disappeared in the United States simply because they instead took the form of racial and ethnic discrimination. Of course, contrary to what Schmitt seems to suggest, it is not true that there is nothing new under the sun. After all, the Third Reich was an attempt to impose a gigantic disemancipation, as Schmitt himself ended up suggesting when, in 1936, immediately after the issuing of the legislation that deprived Jews of political rights. Because they were of a different race to the German Aryan one, he credited Nazism with substituting the concept of man with the concepts of citizen and foreigner. In an Eastern Europe now assimilated to the traditional colonies, the disemancipation pursued by Hitler aimed at imposing, as in the golden age of colonialism, servile or semi-servile labor conditions, which could also be introduced into the heart of the empire. This burden was, of course, to be placed on the shoulders of the lower races, who were to be deprived of political rights and coercively confined to the lower segments of the labor market. As in America before the War of Secession, or in the decades that saw the disemancipation of the blacks and their resubjection to a condition comparable to serfdom. But the Nazi attempt ultimately failed, notwithstanding the gigantic material means at its disposal, and the extreme brutality with which this effort was conducted, with heavy effects even on the Herrenvolk race, itself forced to undergo a terrorist dictatorship imposed by the permanent and total state of war necessary to achieving the objectives pursued. On the other hand, the very history I am here reconstructing shows how it has become practically impossible in our day and age to question the principle of universal and equal suffrage openly. Hence, movements and attempts at disemancipation, which are far from lacking, are forced to move with caution, making concessions to the principle they set out to neutralize. On closer inspection, the history of the fight for suffrage is only one particular aspect of a wider story. It was no accident that the unpropertied, who won political rights with the Revolution of 1848, finally felt themselves elevated to the rank of men. And Marx identifies the meaning of the egalite, which sprang from the French Revolution, not in the assertion of the simple equality of buyers and consumers in the market, but in the unity of human essence, as humans develop a consciousness and behavior as members of the same species. And 20. Thus, the broader history in which the struggles for suffrage, for political and social rights, and against the racialization of difference must be included, is that of the construction of the universal concept of man and humanity as a species. This is the common thread running through the revolutions of the contemporary world, a history that is far from over. 8. The triumph of soft Bonapartism. Democracy, market, total manipulation. The 20th century began and ended with two victories for soft Bonapartism. The first has already been discussed. Before dealing with the second, it is worth dwelling on some of the characteristics of the political regime in question, returning for a moment to Le Bon. After stressing the emotionality and irrationality of crowds, he proposed, as an antidote to universal suffrage, a Caesarist regime that could make skillful use of propaganda devoid of rational arguments, but instead built around the model of commercial advertising. For Schumpeter, it was necessary to acknowledge the serious blow that the French sociologist had dealt to the assumptions underlying the classical doctrine of democracy by demonstrating the irrationality of crowds that was supposed to be the subject of popular sovereignty. In fact, this demonstration itself needs revisiting. In support of his thesis, Le Bon cites, among other things, the chauvinistic excitement of the masses which, in 1870, dragged France into a terrible war with Prussia and into the defeat at Sedan. On the occasion of World War I, we saw Guido d'Orso, an exponent of democratic elitism, chide the masses for their reluctance to accept intervention in the immense bloodbath. An indirect tax, continues Le Bon in his indictment, however exorbitant it be, will always be accepted by the crowd. While it would raise a hue and cry over any immediately visible tax on wages or income, it pays no attention to the modest and barely perceptible variations in the prices of consumer goods, once again confirming its irrationality. Conversely, Mises demonstrates this same irrationality precisely by citing the mass support for the demand for a progressive income tax. Again, according to Le Bon, the crowds that go on strike do so far more in obedience to an order than to obtain an increase of the slender salary with which they make shift. Yet this same French sociologist points out in critical tones that by association and organizing themselves in unions, crowds have come to procure ideas with respect to their interests which are very clearly defined, if not particularly just, and have arrived at a consciousness of their strength. But what then is the alternative to the irrationality of crowds? It is certainly not provided by the intellectuals. For Le Bon, as for Constant, they are devoid of practical sense, full of resentment towards the upper classes, and inclined to chase chimeras and utopias, and thus constitute a further factor clouding political life with passions. Once the monopoly of political rights held by the proprietors the only ones, according to the classical liberal tradition, able to provide guarantees of rationality and political maturity has collapsed. There is nothing left but to rely on the leaders of whom Bagehot speaks. This means relying on the Caesars also invoked by the French sociologist, that is, the men explicitly called upon in each case not only to exploit irrationality, but to fuel it, stirring up some vague dream of glory, through an intensive campaign in the country using thousands of speakers, or, even better, using obsessive repetition, modeled on all-pervasive commercial advertising. Schumpeter's attitude also presents unique aspects of its own. The irrationality of crowds, demonstrated once and for all by Le Bon, demands a new definition of democracy, which is now to be understood only as a political marketplace in which different leaders compete. But to what extent is this market also rational and democratic in character? Already in the strictly economic sphere, we see that consumers are so amenable to the influence of advertising and other methods of persuasion that producers often seem to dictate to them instead of being directed by them. The situation of the consumer voters in the political market is even worse, as here verifying the quality of the product purchased or voted for is even more problematic. The picture of the prettiest girl that ever lived will in the long run prove powerless to maintain the sales of a bad cigarette. There is no equally effective safeguard in the case of political decisions, but this observation does not lead to the logical conclusion that such a regime has little about it that is rational or democratic, nor does it suggest the practical necessity of enlarging such a political market as much as possible, so that the multiplicity of competing political products and advertising campaigns reduces as much as possible the effect of the spell over the consumer voters. Much less does there follow from this a need to block or mitigate in some way the bombardment of advertising by encouraging the development of political parties and organizations which, by promoting their own internal political education and discussion, break or crack the monopoly of communication in the hands of highly centralized mass media. We have seen Mises consider bipartisanship as an indispensable requirement of the market democracy he theorized. And Schumpeter moves in the same direction when he condemns the proportional system. The process of oligopolistic concentration is already clearly more advanced and less controllable at the political level than at the economic level. Rather than being hindered, as antitrust laws theoretically propose to do in the economic sphere proper, in the political sphere this oligopolistic concentration is clearly favored by a whole series of measures, also related to the electoral system itself, that tend to introduce or produce bipartisanship. This is, moreover, a bipartisanship that sees as competitors not two clearly characterized programs, but rather two aspirant leaders. At this point, we can consider definitively complete the reduction of the political community to a market deciding between two political products that, even though they compete with each other, resemble each other as a tube of toothpaste or a bar of soap resembles another of a different brand. The ways in which issues and the popular will on any issue are being manufactured is exactly analogous to the ways of commercial advertising. We find the same attempts to contact the subconscious. We find the same technique of creating favorable and unfavorable associations, which are the more effective the less rational they are. We find the same evasions and reticences, and the same trick of producing opinion by reiterated assertion that is successful precisely to the extent to which it avoids rational argument and the danger of awakening the critical faculties of the people, and so on. Only all these arts have infinitely more scope in the sphere of public affairs than they have in the sphere of private and professional life. Le Bon had already emphasized the systematic repetition of an assertion, in the absence of any rational argument, as the fundamental propaganda tool of the Caesar or hero, called upon to tame the universal suffrage, which also elevates him to power. Schumpeter analyses market democracy in analogous terms. It might seem that this is a critical observation, but to the extent that this reality is considered insurmountable and without alternatives, the critical element dissolves completely. The Austrian-American economist's new theory is thus reduced to the empirical description of the de facto reality in a country like the United States, passed off as the very essence of democracy. It would seem then that this political regime should be reduced to a subtle manipulation of the market which has become completely capitalist. Advertising has become the model of political enlightenment, with the aid of an outrageously persuasive mass media. The observation is Lukács's, but he goes further when he adds, Hitler already clearly understood this when he looked upon a good soap advertisement as a shining example for all political propaganda. Yet, a direct connection between Hitler and capitalist advertising is out of the question. In fact, a strict contrast exists. Hitler's political propaganda was overtly ideological. Obviously, radically different political regimes cannot be hastily juxtaposed or, worse, assimilated under the banner of manipulation, as the Frankfurt School sometimes tends to do. But there is a real problem that cannot be neglected. Le Bon, a writer in many ways linked to the liberal tradition, also became an authority in circles very different to Schumpeter's own. As Gramsci noted, the French sociologist became the model for Mussolini, who boasted of having read all of his work and of having meditated at length on the crowd in particular. Goebbels also got to grips with this text. He too was fully convinced of the effectiveness of propaganda based on the model of commercial advertising and systematic repetition without recourse to rational arguments. Yet, developing as it did in between two world wars and in preparation for a total war, Nazi and fascist propaganda could not but become immediately and explicitly ideological. Conversely, it is in the context of soft Bonapartism and periods of normality that political propaganda tends not only to model itself on commercial advertising, but to identify with it. The 20th century and the new victory of soft Bonapartism. The Cold War, which ended with the collapse of the Eastern European regimes, featured two propaganda apparatuses with quite different characteristics. It has been observed that the mass media's persuasive effect operates at a much deeper level in countries with a pluralistic democracy and a market economy than in totalitarian countries. Indeed, conscious attention represents more of an obstacle than a vehicle for the transmission of persuasive messages. And this is why, paradoxically, the media maximize their power of influence precisely in democratic countries, where the explicit ideological content of messages is relatively low and their potential for indirect persuasion is very high. Particularly instructive is the comparison between the two countries separated by an artificial wall that attempted to divide a nation with a long national tradition behind it. The old methods of Marxist-Leninist despotism were defeated by the West German media, which for years silently exerted their persuasive influence on the citizens of democratic Germany, Einheit ist the United. States' victory in the Cold War, as Bush himself described it, was also the triumph of the mass media over the party school, of subliminal messaging and of covert persuasion over conscious and overt indoctrination. Just as the 20th century began with the demonstration of the superiority of the American model at the moment of its intervention in World War I and then in the course of its development, the century ended with a brilliant new victory for soft Bonapartism. At its center is a leader able to base himself on plebiscitary-type popular investiture, on the very broad powers he exercises, which he can expand beyond all measure through the state of exception, on the holy aura that comes from being the interpreter of a sacred mission of freedom, and on the possibility of drawing on a gigantic apparatus of propaganda and covert persuasion. To identify this victory immediately with the onward march of democracy is to subscribe uncritically to the ideology of war and the empire of freedom. This ideology has constantly accompanied the history of the United States, beating the rhythm of its worldwide rise, and enshrining the triumph of soft Bonapartism in our own time. The theorists of today's triumphant political regime have proceeded to redefine and drastically scale down democracy, which is now purged of any idea of emancipation and even of citizen participation in political decisions. But does soft Bonapartism at least manage properly to safeguard what the liberal school defines and celebrates as negative liberty? To answer this question, we should turn to an author usually considered a classic of liberal democratic thought. What is an absolute monarch? He is one at whose command, if he says, war is necessary, a state of war immediately exists. What is a limited monarch, on the other hand? He who must first consult the people as to whether war is or is not to be. And the people say, there is to be no war, so there is no war. For war is a situation in which all political power must be at the disposal of the sovereign. Now the British monarch has conducted wars aplenty without seeking the consent for them. Therefore, this king is an absolute monarch who ought not to be one, of course, according to the Constitution, but he is always able to bypass it because precisely through those political powers, namely, that he has it in his power to dispense all appointments and posts, he can consider assured the assent of the representatives of the people. A regime such as the one in force in the United States would therefore have to be considered despotic. According to its admirers, who would like to propose this as a model for countries like Italy as well, this regime grants the president such a wide autonomy from the legislature in making decisions that he can send the army to war even without a prior congressional decision. 13, on the other hand, Kant continues in his denunciation, only children can allow themselves to be dazzled by the constitutional dictate, which requires that war spending be approved by Parliament. In the meantime, the latter is called upon to intervene too late when hostilities have already begun at the initiative of the executive, which then has ample room for maneuver to ratify the fait accompli. A people living under such a regime, and sent to war without the consent of itself or its representatives, is not free, but oppressed. 14. Are we to consider such analysis and argumentation obsolete and now unserviceable? In reality, historical developments have given further validity and freshness to a denunciation formulated in an era when compulsory conscription was still unknown, or rather limited. According to a 19th century English liberal philosopher, compulsory conscription reduced the soldier to a condition of slavery, as he was subjected to rigid discipline and even forced to run towards his own death. But under today's regime of soft Bonapartism, an executive that has taken the initiative in involving its country in an international conflict also has the possibility of imposing conscription on large strata of the population and even the entire population. Kant further observes as he denounces the despotic character of a regime that entrusts the executive with the de facto imposition of a state of war, if not its formal declaration, that in an armed conflict, all political power must be at the disposal of the sovereign, and today's sovereign has a far vaster concentration of power at his disposal than was true at the end of the 18th century, with the possibility of making more or less onerous interventions into citizens' essential rights, up to total regimentation in the case of large-scale conflicts. After the experience of Vietnam, even a limited war limited, that is, from the viewpoint of the great power or superpower involved, entails the substantial suppression of freedom of information. Upon the invasion of Grenada in 1983, the White House prevented journalists from covering military operations, entrusting disclosure of what had happened to news bulletins published by the Department of Defense. One journalist would later comment, "The administration seemed to want a monopoly on news, as long as it was able to shape public opinion." 17. The same technique was pursued in subsequent conflicts, reaching the peak of perfection in the Gulf War. The management of information during the first conflict to be broadcast on live TV began a new era of wartime communication, consolidating the administration's control over the media. Here I limit myself to citing the accounts of journalists who can hardly be accused of anti-Americanism. With a pointed strategy which does not hesitate to resort to censorship, disinformation, and rigid control of journalists, the White House and the Pentagon managed to ensure and maintain the consensus of a large share of American public opinion, notwithstanding any isolationist or pacifist inclinations. If in the last century, the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz asserted that the condition for victory was the cohesion of all the combatants, the electronic media had demonstrated that in a modern democracy, the first condition for victory was the cohesion of public opinion. 18. The subordination of information to the needs of mobilization and the regimentation of the war is so complete as to suggest the image of a second front no less important than the battlefield proper. But even more significant is the fact that the experience accumulated in war does not vanish even in times of peace. Hence, recourse to a colossal and intensive propaganda apparatus becomes the normal condition for the exercise of power. Not to see this gigantic mechanism for building political consensus, executive power, international politics, and public relations is simply to fail to understand the heart of American democracy. The American president is more than just a political leader. He is a symbol of national unity. He represents the government, but also the country. He is the heir to an unbroken tradition leading back to the country's founding father, George Washington. Two competing plebiscitary investitures. Soft Bonapartism constitutes a regime not only by virtue of the orderly and painless succession from one leader to the next, but also because competition develops on the basis of an essentially unified platform common to the various candidates competing for the office of the nation's supreme leader and interpreter. This is particularly the case in the United States. Here, I will focus mainly on the 1988 presidential election, not only because a considerable amount of research is already available on the subject, but also because it comes closest to the ideal typical model under investigation here. Let us begin by examining the conventions of the two major parties, following in the footsteps of a scholar whose analysis closely traced how each of them unfolded. The Democratic Convention took place in Atlanta and ended with Michael Dukakis's acceptance speech, greeted by a prolonged ovation. As the delegates sang "God Bless America," Dukakis, Benson the vice presidential candidate, the other primary candidates, and all the Democratic leaders filed into the gallery together, surrounded by their families. The gathering of the entire party behind its candidate is acclaimed with the liveliest enthusiasm. The Orthodox Bishop of Atlanta recites a prayer of thanksgiving before the delegates part in a great spirit of unity. Let us move on to the Republican Convention in New Orleans. In his acceptance speech, Bush, who had already been unanimously nominated by the delegates, insisted on the need to maintain the obligation for teachers to have their students give the Pledge of Allegiance to the national flag in America's classrooms. His words were met with collective enthusiasm. After a long ovation, the convention ends with a prayer recited by the Orthodox Archbishop of New York. Down to the smallest detail, the Republicans make their reply to the Democrats' Atlanta convention. 2. It is not enough to say that presidential conventions, once forums of decision, become in the electronic age ceremonies of ratification. We must go further. In each case, we are witnessing two plebiscitary investitures, consecrated also on the religious level. The beneficiaries of this sort of Caesarist acclamation were two leaders who were indeed competitors, but whose competition, even if very bitter on a personal level, did not exclude a common profession of faith. It is interesting to note the main arguments with which they confronted each other. This time, let us start with Bush, who attacked his Democratic competitor as follows. Dukakis's. Sees America as another pleasant country on the UN roll call, somewhere between Albania and Zimbabwe. And I see America as the leader, a unique nation, with a special role in the world. And this has been called the American century, because in it, we were the dominant force for good in the world. We saved Europe, cured polio, we went to the moon, and lit the world with our culture. And now we are on the verge of a new century. And what country's name will it bear? I say it will be another American century. Our work is not done. Our force is not spent. There is a mission that belongs to the United States, the nation under God's protection. Is Bush here justified in accusing the Democratic nominee of disregarding the mission and the unique role belonging, by the grace of God, to the United States? In fact, in Atlanta, Dukakis had declared that what was at stake was not ideology and meaningless labels, but rather American values. And just as we Democrats believe that there are no limits to what each citizen can do, so we believe that there are no limits to what America can do. 4. Even more significant is the official party platform issued by the Democratic Convention in Atlanta, with this profession of faith at its core. We believe in a stronger America ready to make the tough choices of leadership in an ever-dangerous world, militarily stronger in our overall defense and anti-terrorist capabilities, and in the cohesion of our military alliances, economically stronger at home and in the global marketplace, intellectually stronger in the advances of our schools, science and technology, and spiritually stronger in the principles we exemplify to the world. And to the two candidates, each enjoying plebiscitary investiture by their respective parties, then faced each other in a duel that had to demonstrate who was the privileged interpreter of the American mission in the world. This mission was not itself subject to question. Of course, there was no lack of differences and contrasts between the candidates. But not only did these develop on the basis of a common ground, but they are expressed by a language and an ideology common to both parties, which tend to externalize social conflict. According to the Democratic platform passed in Atlanta, the Republicans are at fault for having converted this proud country into the world's largest debtor nation, now forced to suffer an unhealthy dependence on foreign energy and foreign capital, and the increasing foreign ownership of our land and natural resources. The serious social problems of the United States are somehow ascribed to a kind of foreign invasion that the Republicans have proved unable adequately to confront. As for the duel that developed in 1992, this time between Bush and Clinton, though complicated by Ross Perot's presence, it had similar characteristics. The former gave an address to the Republican convention in Houston, which was shot through with pride at both the military superiority of the United States and its unique and exceptional role as bearer of the right to liberate Cuba and to intervene in every corner of the world. Bush even issued a slogan, "America is the land where the sun is always peeking over the horizon," that seemed to echo Charles V's famous boast that the sun never set on his vast empire. In turn, Clinton concluded his speech accepting the Democratic nomination by painting the picture of an America with the world's strongest defense, ready and willing to use force when necessary. An America that will not coddle tyrants, from Baghdad to Beijing. God bless America. Again, the 1992 electoral contest took place on the basis of a common belief in American leadership which, even before being political, military in character, is enshrined in moral and religious terms. Hence, the 1992 campaign had Clinton challenging the incumbent president to intervene also in the former Yugoslavia, and blaming him for having squandered U.S. economic supremacy. And Bush, in reply, accused the Democratic Party of besmirching America, attributing to it an imaginary weakness, and forgetting that it was still the strongest economy in the world. In his contest with Dukakis in 1988, Bush had proudly stressed that he had learned the meaning of America's mission in the world from his own military involvement in World War II. And similarly, 4 years later, he accused his challenger Clinton of shirking his duty to fight for his country in Vietnam. It is not even asked what the concrete meaning of any particular war may have been. Whatever it is, if it involved American soldiers, it is cast as a mission that no citizen can shirk. And most importantly, a politician aspiring to lead the nation on which this mission is incumbent must himself be worthy of it. This explains Bush's confession that he felt fully the president only after his baptism of fire in the invasion of Panama. In his victory speech on election night 1988, referring also to the congratulations he had received from Dukakis in the great tradition of American politics, Bush had said, "And I thank God for the faith he's given me, and as I grow older, I'm more aware of the spiritual element in life, and I ask for God's help. And now we will move again, for an America that is strong and resolute in the world, strong and big-hearted at home." 31. The 1988 contest that had started with two competing plebiscitary investitures ended as it began, with the reaffirmation of the American mission in the world, which was once again religiously consecrated. But this time, this mission was reaffirmed by a leader who had received the investiture of the entire nation, and who could therefore make use of the extraordinary breadth of powers granted to a president who is the sole interpreter of the people congressmen, who are elected according to the single-member system, instead represent an individual district and the particular interests prevailing in it. More than that, the U.S. president is the interpreter of a people with a global role so peculiar and unique that it can be considered, to quote 1/20th century American Senator Albert J. Beveridge, to be the one that God marked as his chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world. The 1992 contest ended in a similar fashion. Not surprisingly, one of the winner's first acts was to reaffirm the continuation of his predecessor's foreign policy and the ideology that inspired it, built on America's global mission. Soft Bonapartism, competitive monopartisanship, and the power of lobbies. Because of the ideology, rather, because of the common national religion they express, the two major and, as we shall see, somewhat official electoral competitors seem to refer more to different factions within one party than to two different parties. The statement may seem excessive, but even in Tocqueville we can read, one would say that here there are factions, but not parties properly so called. Men are everything, principles are little. This is an opinion expressed in the course of a conversation with the President of the Bank of the United States, who in turn observes that, at least since the Jackson presidency, there have been no parties proper, opposed to one another and professing conflicting political faiths. The fact is that there are now no two practicable ways of governing this people, and that political passions can be exercised in matters of administrative detail and not over principles. 30. Doubtless the image of America that emerges from this interview is rather rose-tinted. When Tocqueville claims that, in the country of universal suffrage, the people are everything and no one still dares to struggle against them, and that opinions differ only by nuances, it is clear that he has in mind exclusively the white community. And the situation which the two authoritative interlocutors describe is explained by the fact that blacks had no opportunity to express themselves politically. Paired with the camouflaging and softening of conflicts within the white community by means of expansion into the far west at the expense of the Native Americans. So, far from being an expression of a conciliated and peaceful society, the absence of real parties rests on the violent externalization of conflicts and tensions within the dominant race, to the detriment of the populations condemned to silence. The substantial agreement on the basic choice to externalize conflicts explains why the two political groups in the white community are configured, in Tocqueville's language, more like two factions than two real political parties, limiting their opposition, according to the American banker's description, to administrative details. When, for a series of reasons, the agreement on the externalization of conflicts broke down, this produced not only a sharp political clash, but a bloody civil war. Yet the two parties rebuilt their unity, and again became effectively two factions of the same party, thanks to a compromise which, while not formally reintroducing slavery, nevertheless effected a ruthless disemancipation of the blacks. This political system seemed to plunge into crisis again in 1896, when, in unusual circumstances, William Jennings Bryan, a populist figure, or in any case, one strongly influenced by the populist movement of the poor peasants and other popular strata, became the Democratic Party's presidential candidate. Not by chance, upon this same election, the votes of substantial sectors of the Democratic Party rallied behind the Republican candidate. Party loyalty was defeated by class solidarity among the privileged strata of U.S. society. This confirmed the fact that, having overcome the previous crisis, the Democrats and Republicans increasingly started to behave not as two parties, but as two factions of a single party, now tending to become an official state party. In 1968, the Supreme Court had to intervene to declare unconstitutional the legislative measures in some states aimed at limiting the possibility of running in presidential elections to the candidates of the two major parties, alone. Yet, In April 1975, an authoritative American journal observed that all states restricted ballot access to third parties and independent candidates. The list of obstacles is endless. In some states, acceptance of a candidacy was conditional on the payment of a tax, sponsorship by a certain number of voters, or a commitment to respect the Constitution intended to discourage radical parties. Finally, no one can meaningfully take part in the electoral contest without being able to draw on enormous sums of money. As far as presidential elections are concerned, there are provisions for federal contributions, and yet only candidates who achieve 10% of the votes in one of the two parties' primaries can draw on these funds. This is a further measure to support and protect bipartisanship, or rather competitive monopartisanship. When an outsider to the dominant political system manages to overcome the various legislative obstacles and secure a place on the ballot in every state. Well, here is where media censorship intervenes. Let us take the 1,988 elections, who, even in the United States itself, knew that, in addition to Bush and Dukakis, a certain Leonora B. Fulani was running for president. Fulani? She was a black woman, a psychologist from New York, supported by the black community, disappointed by the Democratic Party, who expressed a pacifist agenda, friendship with Cuba, and solidarity with the Palestinian people. The television stations that organized the electoral debates were very careful not to invite her on, or even mention her name. This resulted in an appeal to the commission that is supposed to guarantee equal opportunities for the various candidates. The television companies had deprived the American electorate of the knowledge that there is a third national candidate. This was the basis of the appeal, which was rejected on the grounds that the television companies had, as was their right, considered Ms. Fulani's candidacy not newsworthy enough. Yet, in those same days, a public opinion poll conducted by the Wall Street Journal and NBC News showed that 63% of voters did not feel represented by either the Republican or Democratic candidate. In fact, in a country where the electoral contest mainly plays out as a televised duel, the participants are largely decided by the large monopolistic corporations who control the TV channels and the major media outlets, condemning Fulani to silence and excluding other minor candidates, but not Perot. The soft Bonapartist political regime does not develop in a vacuum, nor does it hover above existing social relations, which it instead ratifies and tends to eternalize. In the countries where the hollowing out of political parties has gone furthest, we are in fact witnessing the return of discrimination based on wealth. The party has lost control of the lines of information and communication. It has also lost control of the selection of top candidates. The party, in addition, is losing control of campaigns. Television and the computer have produced a new class of electronic political specialists. Campaigns abandon the traditional paraphernalia of mass democracy. Volunteers, rallies, torchlight processions, leaflets, posters, billboards, bumper stickers. Political action, once labor-intensive, becomes capital-intensive. Again, with regard to the United States, observers agree in noting the appallingly high costs of recent election campaigns, whose rise far outstrips inflation. Between 1976 and 1988, legislative election expenditures nearly quintupled. They multiplied by 4.3 times over, while the price index over the same period more than doubled. From 57 to 119, the result is increasingly to limit politics to candidates who have money of their own or who take money from political action committees, primarily meaning lobbies. The functioning of the American model, often cited as an example, is clear. It costs $100 billion to win the White House, and the highest office in the land is in fact bought with a river of money. An instrumental reading of history, and the advent of the Chancellor's democracy. While the American model had already been a source of fascination in Europe, especially after World War I, in recent decades it has borne even greater concrete influence on our continent. The political regime established in Germany after World War II is often called a Kanzlerdemokratie, a term modeled on the Führerdemokratie, dear to Weber, that is, a democracy hinging on the figure of the Chancellor, who strikes the pose of being both responsible to the nation and its privileged interpreter. In this case, the undermining of the proportional system is only partial. Yet we must not forget the threshold clause, an obstacle to parties that achieve under 5% of the votes from entering parliament, and the harassment or persecution of communists, who were first officially outlawed and then, through the Berufsverbot, which has still not been revoked, kept on the margins of legality and banned from the state apparatus and public employment. On the whole, these measures were motivated not so much by the concern to ensure governmental stability, which certainly does not seem to run any great risks in Germany, as by the desire to ensure the political and social homogeneity of parliament by barring access to the Communist Party. Its presence would have been troubling not only because of its political ideas in the Cold War, but also because, as an organized political party, despite its small strength, it objectively countered the tendency. already seen in Bonapartism, not to tolerate filters between leader and nation and to deprive the subaltern classes of any independent political representation. In the early years of the Federal Republic, the residual social democratic resistance to the dismantling or downsizing of the proportional system was overcome with the help of a historical analysis that blamed the previous electoral system for the rise of Nazism and fascism. 2. This thesis, formulated by a German-American sociologist, then became a sort of official state doctrine in the Federal Republic of Germany, of course. The claim that Hitler would have been blocked by a system of single-member constituencies, that is, the electoral system invoked by authoritative fascist circles in Italy on the eve of Mussolini's dictatorship, has yet to be proved. In any case, a historical balance sheet that, in seeking to explain the irresistible rise of Nazism, starts from the Weimar Republic and not from the catastrophe of World War I. The beginning of a crisis from which the country was unable to recover is surely rather instrumental. Such a reading objectively ends up indicting the very political and social forces which, after 1918, drawing on the terrible lesson of the war, intended to build a peaceful and democratic Germany based on the proportional system, that is, the forces characterized by their stance in favor of a rupture of the imperial and Bonapartist tendencies manifested, already starting with Bismarck, in the Second Reich, with its single-member system, responsible for dragging the country into an unprecedented bloodbath. We have seen, on the other hand, Weber a fervent chauvinist, to the last calling for the fullest development of the Bonapartist and Caesarist tendencies and, to this end, coming out clearly in favor of a system based on presidentialism and the single-member constituency. For Weber, this would have allowed Germany more effectively to fulfill a great power role, responding to the challenge of the powers that had defeated it and preceded it in consistently following the path of Caesarism. Paradoxically, in his condemnation of proportional representation, German-American sociologist Ferdinand Hermans refers to this same Weber, who also aroused the interest of General Ludendorff, as he makes his attempt to indict the forces who fought for democracy and proportionality in the Weimar Republic for their supposed role in Hitler's triumph. 45. In reality, in the very first months following the defeat of the Third Reich, the occupying Western powers, including Britain and the United States, appear to have favored the continuation of the electoral system that had been in force in the years preceding Hitler's coming to power. A simple distraction? Another explanation seems more probable. Initially, the dominant concern was the possibility of a revanchist Germany rising from the ashes. Against such a danger, this electoral system, not by chance, already adopted in the Weimar Republic by the democratic forces who had been won to the cause of peace, might well prove useful. But once the Cold War began to rage, and it was deemed necessary to expel the communists from representative bodies, the proportional system immediately became a great impediment. The capital sin of this electoral system, Hermans, the sociologist de Schumpeter and Hayek had already noted in 1941, was that it made it possible, even in a country like Britain, for communists to be elected to parliament from the industrial centers of the country. This observation takes us back to a theme that was common currency in the 19th century debate. It was above all Bagehot, to whom Herman repeatedly refers, who pointed out that proportional representation had the great drawback of allowing industrial centers to send to parliament persons representing the beliefs or the unbeliefs of the lowest classes in their towns, the isms. The great political and ideological issues would make their way into representative bodies together with workers and craftsmen. Hermans in turn observes that even if the communist group formed in the British Parliament, thanks to proportional representation, might be very small, it would still seriously hinder the Labour Party's move towards the centre. This would itself undermine the character that elections in Great Britain had, and everywhere should have, as the plebiscitary investiture of the leader of one of the two great parties. Thus emerges the preference for a regime with more or less Bonapartist characteristics, a preference that Hermans shares with Weber but also with Spengler and other implacable enemies of the Weimar Republic, who violently indicted it for its weakness on the international stage. Gaullism and the presidential republic in France. When we examine the onward march of soft Bonapartism after World War II, events in France are particularly significant. The events leading up to the replacement of the French Constitution began with a military pronunciamento in Algiers on May 13, 1958. Declared to the cry of the army to power, it developed with the landing of paratroopers in Corsica 10 days later, who rapidly occupied the island. The coup ended with the rise to power of a general, still surrounded by the aura of glory he had taken on during World War II. This was a classic Bonapartist scenario, and similarly classic was the recourse to a referendum to legitimize the results of the coup and the new constitution, based on a radical personalization of power. Official propaganda hammered home the message that saying yes to de Gaulle meant saying yes to France. Again, we see the habitual technique of externalizing conflict, tending to pass off opponents of the coup as substantially foreign to the national soul. It was no accident that the general president immediately set himself up as the privileged interpreter of eternal France and its national grandeur. Yet this was how the referendum that marked the birth of the Fifth Republic unfolded. The campaign was brief but fervent, equal to the importance of what was at stake. The yes vote overwhelmed the no vote, both in terms of the number of movements that supported it, and in terms of the superiority of the means placed at their disposal by the public authorities. Posters, leaflets, millions of copies of a newspaper written for the occasion pushed the yes vote with an obsessive insistence that opponents denounced as abusive. In fact, the official envelope sent to every citizen contained, in addition to the ballot paper and the text of the Constitution subject to referendum, the speech delivered on 4 September by General de Gaulle recommending its adoption. As Weber made clear, the Caesarist leader does not come to power through any normal vote or election, but by means of a plebiscite. And when the hegemony held at the level of civil society, deriving primarily from the monopoly of the means of material and mental production, is not enough to guarantee control of the media, state power also intervenes. The Caesarist leader, Weber further underlines, is raised to power not on the basis of a program with determinate political contents, but by virtue of a profession of faith. And immediately after the referendum, the most authoritative French press outlets spoke of the blank check that had been handed to de Gaulle. As at the time of Louis Napoleon, political parties were now in the firing line, as was any electoral system that favored them, for the latter introduced a troublesome filter in the direct and immediate relationship between the atomized masses and the leader, hindering the profession of faith that must bind them to him. The new constitution, whose drafting drew, among other things, on a study of the Bonapartist Constitution of 1852, immediately introduced the single-member constituency. In this regard, there was a significant change in de Gaulle's attitude. In 1945, damning the instability of the Third Republic based on single-member constituencies, he had introduced proportional representation, albeit altered and modified so as to favor the major parties. 13 years later, the general had radically changed his mind, now having fully understood the functionality of the single-member system in relation to the Bonapartist regime he was preparing to implement. Unlike Louis Napoleon, the general president did not set up a personal Bonapartist dictatorship, which would have been incapable of lasting over time and of ensuring an orderly succession. Rather, he established a regime, one that functioned so well that it then saw the rise in extended rule, across 2 7-year terms, of the same François Mitterrand, who had earlier combatively denounced the Bonapartist inspiration of what he rightly defined as the coup d'état of 1958.33 here. Again, we can see the agility with which, within the framework of soft Bonapartism, it is possible to move from normality to the state of exception. This was again apparent at the most acute moment of crisis in 1968, when de Gaulle mysteriously disappeared, only to resurface after he had a reassuring conversation in Baden-Baden, across the West German border, with General Massu, the head of the most tried and tested military units. The president was ready to turn into a dictator upon the enactment of a state of exception, of whose advent he was the sole judge. The single-member system, Bonapartism, and the political decapitation of the subaltern classes. Thus far, Italy has been an exception. The drives towards Bonapartism, owing to foreign policy factors, have been absent or weaker in this country. Moreover, the convergence of two political traditions, communist and Christian Democrats, though so different from each other, has so far played a role in defending the proportional system and a democracy founded on parliament and the parties. Already in the early post-war period, they opposed the variegated bloc liberals, nationalists, and even fascists that called for a return to the single-member constituency. Indeed, while this call again raised its head in 1945, it had little chance of success in the political and spiritual climate of the time. The spirit of the resistance still prevailed, fed and directed by organized mass parties fighting against a regime that had enjoyed the support, complicity, or benevolent detachment of economic and political circles who, after 1919, still dreamed of the return to Italy of the single-member constituency and of the rule of notables. In the Constituent Assembly elected in 1946, Palmiro Togliatti declared that the organized mass parties, which these other forces sought to liquidate by scuttling the proportional system, were the new classes that are rising and organizing themselves to control their own representation, to participate in the political direction of the country. A few years ago, a Catholic historian, Roberto Ruffilli later, the victim of a barbaric and mysterious terrorist crime, observed that the single-member system tends to dismantle the positions of organized mass parties in favor of parties of opinion, and perhaps of those most able to assert themselves through the mass media and political spectacle, at least until recently. Communists and Catholics were well aware of the not only political but also social significance of proportional representation. The attack against it was seen as an integral part of the conservative attempt to drive the popular classes back into a condition of political subalternity and to guarantee the big monopolies and financial groups' control, even of representative bodies. But today the situation is completely different, for there are three projects, both competing and intersecting, for the liquidation of the First Republic. The first is that which is expressed by the Lega Nord, whose most radical and extremist sectors seem to envisage a northern republic founded on some form of disemancipation of southern immigrants. This is the only way to understand the Lega's threatening intimations against southerners and the indignant denunciations of their supposed effect in taking northerners' jobs and taking up too much space in the public sector and in the apparatus of administration and government. Leafing through the Lega's propaganda, or at least its more extreme variants, you get the impression of rereading the texts of late 19th century U.S. nativists, who demanded the disemancipation of immigrants, or at least the drastic lengthening of the terms for their naturalization. The latter, too, were portrayed as dirty, incapable of serious and honest work or serious and honest participation in political life, and above all denounced as a germ of criminal contamination. The American nativists' campaigns redoubled in intensity in periods of crisis, and in the context of today's Italy, it is easy to understand the racialization process to the detriment of Southerners, who were welcomed quite differently at the time of the post-war economic miracle with its soaring demand for labor power, as we have seen, even. When it did not formally deprive them of political rights, the process of disemancipation that developed in America at the end of the 19th century confined immigrants to the lower segments of the labor market. It cannot be ruled out that, albeit in different conditions, presenting objectively greater hurdles to the legisti, something similar could happen in Italy too. The other two projects for institutional reform or counter-reform refer to the American model, in these cases consciously. In the first case, rather than altering the mechanism of election, important social and political forces are pursuing the creation of a presidential republic based, as has been observed, on a way of forming government leadership that breaks the monopoly of the large mass parties through an accentuation of the personal and charismatic quality inherent in leadership. Then there is the project fronted by Mario Segni, summarized as follows in the authoritative Il Sole 24 Ore. Through the single-member constituency, possibly in the British style, that is without runoff elections, or secondarily, in the French style, that is including such runoffs, it would seek a dualistic alignment of the party landscape. These parties, moreover, should be firmly and sincerely, even in their diversity, bourgeois. Here we have the basic premises of competitive monopartisanship, whose structure can be completed with appropriate integrative reforms to be introduced at a later date. 8. As we can see, while these three projects are competitors in tactical terms given their different dimensions and the rival interests and calculations of the parties and political forces behind them on a more properly strategic level, they are intertwined and convergent. We have seen that the single-member system has always been a favored tool of Bonapartism, as also suggested by its systematic recourse to the abrogative referendum, which, as Weber authoritatively clarified, constitutes the specific instrument of purely plebiscitary democracy. In rejecting proportional representation, Bonapartist propaganda has also constantly denounced the scourge of parties that stand between the authentic will of the people and the leader, whether that means the leader of the individual local constituency or the supreme leader of the nation. This immediate relationship is distorted, again according to Bonapartist propaganda, by the presence of organized parties. Indeed, the target under fire from all the current rival reform projects in Italy is the so-called partyocracy. It is proposed that this system of domination by the parties should be literally thrown away, through secession from the part of the country considered incurably infected, or else drastically counterbalanced by means of a strong executive or the suppression of the proportional system, thus leaving room only for decentralized and weak party structures. Somehow of the American style, as we have seen, in this model country, the monopoly of political representation by the propertied has practically been reintroduced. This is most evident in the case of elections to Congress, where there is no form of the public financing that some now seek to abolish in Italy. Also pushing in the same direction are the proposals that seek to penalize minor parties by denying parliamentary representation to lists that do not reach some threshold of votes. Leaving aside the petty concerns of immediate electoral calculations, these measures are the contemporary analog of the 19th century imposition upon the press of various taxes and deposit payments, which the ruling classes used to hinder the newspapers that gave voice to the subaltern classes, thus ensuring their own media control through supplementary political means. Now that the mass media, especially those with the greatest impact, are the unchallenged monopoly of the big bourgeoisie, all that remains is to force the disappearance or downsizing of those parties that still purport to function as autonomous centers of intellectual production. It is interesting to examine the ideology on which the campaign against organized parties is based. They are accused of constraining a frank and healthy individualism. Given the irrepressible existential difference of each individual, their claim or aspiration to represent classes or interests is absurd. As we have seen, these are the same arguments that the ruling classes has long used in order to ban workers from forming associations. The indiscriminate campaign against parties claims to be targeting corruption. This was the same watchword that presided over the movement in the late 19th century United States, which resulted in the disemancipation of blacks, immigrants, and poor whites. In his day, Tocqueville, certainly not a champion of ideological and internally structured parties, remarked that, from the absence of parties, America had gained a great deal in happiness, but not in morality. In the late 19th century United States, the weakening of the parties, touted as the answer to the phenomenon of political corruption, ended up sanctioning the rapid growth of the intertwining of and exchanging of favors between the political and business worlds, and the excessive power of the lobbies, leading even a conservative critic of parties to underline the cynical audacity with which they have often used their wealth to seduce officials and legislators from the path of virtue. 4. To those who think that returning to single-member elections, with the related hollowing out of the parties, would in itself offer a remedy to corruption, we may suggest that they read good old Gaetano Salvemini. In Giolitti's Italy, the single-member constituencies, besides being infested with corruption, were under the joint domination of organized crime, the Camorra, and the police. What use would they be if the government did not have to use them in case of necessity? But how could the work of the minister of the underworld and his hatchet men continue undisturbed? A journalist of the time explained, in the small constituencies of the single-member electoral system, with its weak or non-existent parties, the political struggle saw only the opposition between personal factions competing to thieve the most from public affairs. Political life was as if confiscated by local factions that usurped public property and civil rights. They supported any government, so long as it allowed the systematic robbery of their followers to flourish and reciprocated their mercenary obedience with illicit favors. Puglia was charged with providing a large contingent to that murky parliamentary mass that ministers summon by telegraph in moments of battle. It is known in the corridors of the chamber as the cattle cart, on account of the bovine docility with which it serves any master. Moreover, in 1920, regretting the results of the first elections held under the proportional system, it was the ardent nationalist proponents of the single-member constituency who lamented the fact that the list vote left little margin for individual corruption, with the effect that the latter had become relatively minimal. We see what is really at stake today when a supporter of the single-member system and bipartisanship or competitive monopartisanship declares that this is a question of opening up public and social services, health, school, pensions, at least partially, to the logic of the market, and of dismantling once and for all what he defines as the welfare state in partyocratic sauce. As in the past, the attack on universal suffrage or on the proportional system goes hand in hand with the assertion of a free market economic policy. This is the same context in which we should also set the rise of the leagues which, radicalizing their fight against the much-denounced redistribution of income in favor of the South, have ended up calling for northern secession. 9. Yet, in Italy, Bonapartism and the single-member system are still having a hard time achieving victory. There is no lack of signs of impatience. All constitutional revisions respond to that sort of unwritten law that experts call the rule of the external event. This principle says that modern constitutions are altered or even totally replaced because of external and, plus 70, traumatic events. This observation can also provide a key to interpreting the murky happenings that have marked Italian political life for some time now, the trajectory of today's liberalism. We have seen that, even according to its admirers, the West's leading country is characterized by a political system in which the leader holds such sweeping executive powers that he can independently decide to go to war and invoke and introduce the state of exception. We have seen that even in periods of normality, this leader can draw on an apparatus of propaganda and covert persuasion that would have been the envy of Joseph Goebbels. Such a situation confronts liberal thought with a new situation which, judging by the watchwords it has constantly raised throughout its history, ought to have sounded its alarm bells. But this has not been the case. On the contrary, we can well speak of an involution, of which Popper perhaps represents the most extreme example. In declaring misleading and dangerous the question of who should rule, the theorist of the open society pointed to the control and limitation of power as the central problem of philosophy and political life. In a 1955 essay, he had even raised a disturbing question. How far do publishers' monopolies establish a kind of censorship? The gigantic concentration of political and multimedia power, which showed its enormous potential for censorship, disinformation, and manipulation during an episode like the Crusade against Iraq, is plain for all to see. But anyone who expected the theorist of the open society to pay attention to such problems would be gravely disappointed. On the contrary, Popper not only seeks to silence or blame the few voices of dissent, but also promotes new punitive expeditions on the model of the Gulf War, which would inevitably lead to a new and gigantic concentration of power in the belligerent countries. Quite different, and much more balanced, is of course the position of Norberto Bobbio. He recognizes the inversion of the relationship between controllers and controlled, given that, through the unscrupulous use of the mass media, elected representatives now control the voters. But instead of drawing the conclusion that the now dominant political regime does not even meet the requirements he himself defines as the minimum to fall under the category of democracy, the Turin philosopher seems to encourage resignation. This resignation sometimes goes as far as endorsing projects for electoral and institutional counter-reform, which aim, in the last analysis, at achieving a competitive monopartisanship that would itself entrench the inversion of the relationship between controllers and controlled. Such projects would themselves eliminate, or further drastically reduce, the possibility of choosing between real alternatives, which the Turin philosopher identified as one of the minimum requirements of democracy. But beyond the attitude taken by this or that single author, there is a general trend to be noted. Today, we are witnessing a paradox. The liberal tradition has long stressed the need for intermediate bodies as a counterweight to despotism. It is a theme that Tocqueville long emphasized, looking not so much at the danger constituted by monarchical power as at that constituted by the omnipotence of the majority, or at least by a power consecrated by popular vote, without associations, including, in the first place, political ones. There is no longer any dike against any sort of tyranny. Even the French liberal was not entirely consistent in the approach to which he laid claim. He does not seem to have fought for the legalization of workers' associations, which in France were persecuted even by the governments of the Second Republic, to which Tocqueville himself belonged. But today one cannot even speak of inconsistency. The stages in the rise of soft Bonapartism are regularly patterned by a campaign that pursues and ultimately succeeds in the cutting back and marginalizing of organized political parties, that is, the only intermediate bodies today, capable of hindering a power that has assumed much more disturbing proportions than those foreseen or feared by the author of Democracy in America. Despite their formal homage to the liberal tradition, its followers today seem to be concerned not with the limitation of power, but exclusively with its efficiency and capacity for rapid action. This phenomenon manifests itself at various levels. Not only Kant, but also the Anglo-Saxon political tradition, long expressed great distrust for the standing army. Yet the standing army of the time was less worrying than the powerful professional armies today's liberals praise. A similar fact can also be noted regarding the debate on electoral systems. As is well known, John Stuart Mill insisted on the absolute necessity of proportional representation to avoid the collective despotism of the numerical majority, which was already at least raising its head in the United States. Yet the electoral system recommended by the author of Considerations on Representative Government as an effective antidote to power is today resolutely condemned and abandoned just when, from the standpoint of liberal theory. Such an antidote would appear most necessary, given the enormous expansion of this power in the intervening period. But if this is a remarkable reversal of positions, it does have a certain logic. Mill feared that, with the extension of suffrage, the working classes, in Britain and Europe, much more widespread and numerous than their counterparts in the United States, could gain a majority, using it to substitute the class ascendancy of the poor for that of the rich. The rule of the numerical majority would end up becoming a class government, in the sense that it would sanction the undisputed power of the majority of poor over a minority who, in contradistinction, may be called rich, who, in the absence of the proportional system, would be denied any representation. This is why the English liberal both recommended plural voting, tilted to the advantage of the rich and intelligent in order to readjust the balance of power. And, bearing in mind the difficulties of introducing unequal suffrage, he also insisted on the abandonment of the first-past-the-post electoral system then in force, which heavily penalizes or even silences the minority. But Mill was wrong. He was still thinking about a situation in which the trumpets of the bourgeoisie could be countered by the bells of the working classes. The substantial monopoly of the press and mass media makes his concerns obsolete. The class government that actually exists today is certainly not the working class's one he feared, and it is liberal politicians and thinkers who condemn proportional representation. Such is the case of Giolitti, Pareto, Mosca, Hayek, and Schumpeter, and it seems also of Bobbio. In Italy, a vast array of forces claims to want to change the political and electoral system in order to impose not only bipartisanship, but a bipartisanship that, having as protagonists two bourgeois parties, is in fact structured as competitive monopartisanship. To put this in Mill's language, it means a class government that ensures itself the monopoly of parliamentary representation, soft Bonapartism, and Marx's analysis of bourgeois democracy. I have defined the regime that is heading towards triumph in our century as a soft Bonapartism. As we conclude, it is worth dwelling for a moment on this category, comparing it with other competing ones. Some have spoken of democratic elitism, but such a definition helps very little in understanding the political reality of our times. First, let us focus on the adjective. Does it make sense to define as democratic a reality and a political conception that not only considers irrelevant the problem of citizens' participation in the choices meant to determine the fate of the community in which they live, but that explicitly theorizes mass electoral abstentionism as a positive and indeed essential factor for the stability and proper functioning of the system? Abstentionism has taken the place of the explicit denial of political citizenship of large social strata, once seen by the theorists of census discrimination as the ineliminable presupposition of the representative regime. It has been rightly observed that all elite theories are founded on two basic assumptions. First, that the masses are inherently incompetent, and second, that they are, at best, pliable, inert stuff, or at worst, aroused, unruly creatures possessing an insatiable proclivity to undermine both culture and liberty. But is this not exactly the assumption that provided the classical liberal tradition with its basis for denying suffrage to the childlike multitude? There is likewise little that is democratic about the elitism which, in Schumpeter's formulation, considers the exclusion of this or that ethnic, and possibly social, community from political rights as normal and uncontroversial. And it is doubtful even that such an elitism can be defined as liberal, given its sympathy for a regime of personal power so broad that it can decide autonomously on war, and the state of exception. That is, it can make use of prerogatives that, according to good old Kant, are proper to despotism alone. In a certain sense, even the noun is to be considered misleading. It does not take sufficient account of the personalization of power, a characteristic that clearly distinguishes the current political and institutional order from the regime directed by the representative elite so dear to size. The category of democratic Caesarism is more appropriate, but even this is not fully satisfactory. The noun has the disadvantage of referring to an event in the distant past, rather than to a chapter of contemporary history that begins with mass or universal suffrage. Moreover, the adjective risks acting as a pretext for legitimation. The category I propose exposes itself to the objection already raised against political categories and analyses suspected of excessively comparing the political and constitutional structure in today's West to dictatorial regimes and those resulting from coups d'état. In reality, the French Fifth Republic was itself the product of a coup. And as we have seen, even when it comes to the genesis of the U.S. Constitution, there has been no lack of historians who have spoken of a more or less camouflaged coup d'état. Above all, this objection fails to take into account the distinction between a Bonapartist dictatorship of a single personality and a Bonapartist regime based on an ordered and regulated succession, capable of ensuring its continuation over time. The most recent developments in reality, and even in political theory, in the West have fully validated Marx's analysis, which is today, paradoxically, even more fitting and illuminating than at the time it was formulated. Let us quickly revisit the key passages. 1. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal consequently also controls the means of mental production. This is a text I have reflected upon already, and whose extraordinary relevance is confirmed every day by the more precise analyses of what has aptly been defined as the multimedia principality. However, it must be added that this latter term refers to the realm of the social class that controls the mass media, exercising a power that in some ways runs even deeper than Marx had envisaged. For today, the control of the means of material production entails the control of means of mental production so powerful as to allow a manipulative pressure that is exercised upon individuals' acts of volition even before it shapes their external behavior. 2. According to Capital, the freedom and equality of which the bourgeois theory of democracy speaks refers only to the sphere of circulation and constitutes its ideological expression. Reduced by Schumpeter to the market, democracy no longer even implies political equality, which Bobbio too expels from the minimal definition of democracy. At the end of the 19th century, the national liberal, Treitschke, expressed his admiration for American democracy, which was able to control the plebs much more effectively than Imperial Germany. Let us examine the most delightful plebs in the world, in New York. It is the collection of the refuse that has flowed in from all over the earth, and yet, left to themselves, these corrupt elements are forced to control themselves. Do you think there is a Prussian police force capable of restraining them as they are restrained by the strict law of necessity? Everyone knows this much very well, that no one will pay any attention if I starve. It would seem that such a model is coming back into vogue. 3. Democracy conceived in this way was limited, according to Marx, to giving the electorate the possibility of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to misrepresent, wer unzertreten, The People in Parliament 84, the most recent political theory, conceives democracy precisely as the competitive investiture of a leader granted such sweeping powers that he can involve the entire country in military adventures of his own independent volition. Soft Bonapartism has developed with the state of exception in mind, a situation in which the leader can transform himself into a dictator, at least in the Roman sense of the term, without difficulty. And precisely by examining this transformation, Marx sees the moment of dictatorship which is already latent and implicit in bourgeois democracy, the new disemancipation and the long-term future of democracy. Without doubt, this extraordinarily insightful phenomenology of power ends up with a utopian and utopic solution, the withering away of the state, a solution that has played a catastrophic role in all attempts to build a is not possible to dwell here on a post-capitalist or NNO-capitalist society 8T5 theme that I have already analyzed elsewhere. The fact is that, already in Marx, and even more so in the tradition that took its cue from him, one senses the negative influence of the anarchist tradition, with its irreducible hostility towards the idea of representation. Suggesting to Bakunin the idea of Saturn who represented his children to the extent that he devoured them, this is the case even of Lenin's State and Revolution. It was published at a time when the denunciation of the liberal or liberal bitterist, as it could not fail to democratic representative regimes, was at its B. Given that in World War I these regimes really did function in the way described by the anarchist leader, calmly immolating millions of men, the represented, in a gigantic sacrificial rite. In State and Revolution, we read that even the most developed democracy cannot do without representative institutions. Yet the myth of the withering away of the state continued to fuel mistrust of the idea of representation. This, even the very moment when, as Kelsen aptly observes, the leaders of Soviet Russia were increasing the number of representative bodies, which the Soviets undoubtedly were, and did not shy away even from second-degree representation. Marx, like the tradition inspired by him, sometimes contrasts direct democracy to parliamentary democracy. This opposition stems from the rejection of a representation that is reduced to a simple theater without real effect in the factories and workplaces. There, the workers are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants, and continue to be subjected to a despotism, which in practice deprives them of that same negative freedom that even the liberal tradition claims to cherish. 9. Yet, this counterposition seems to spring from the illusion that, with the disappearance of the mediation of representation, the people is thus able to express its own authentic charge of emancipation, without obstacles or distortions. This illusion is well understood from the epistemological assumptions of anarchism, which sometimes takes on irrationalist tones, with Bakunin's constant devotion to celebrating instinct and life, as opposed to thought, and its pretense to prescribe rules to life. But such an illusion can hardly be reconciled with Marx's thesis that the dominant ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, that is, the same class that monopolizes the material and mental means of production. In our day, we face a paradox. The proponents of direct democracy, not the kind that takes place in factories and workplaces, but the kind that dispenses with the mediation of parties, are the real proponents of soft Bonapartism. Here, the leader of the nation under the presidential regime, or the leader of a given electoral constituency under the single-member system, must be designated directly by the atomized people, deprived of their modest means of autonomous mental and political production, and helplessly delivered up to the totalitarian power of the mass media, monopolized by the big bourgeoisie. Despite its fundamental limitations, Marx's analysis still has a lot to say with regard to the construction of democracy in countries with high industrial development and a ramified and complex civil society. It has been rightly observed that democracy increasingly becomes an empty slogan unless measures are taken to promote democratic political communication. In spite of the extreme difficulty of the task, it would be necessary to free multimedia communication from its subordination to both the political system and the system of production, and to liberate it from the advertising paradigm that increasingly unites these two subsystems. This is a courageous conclusion that seems to run against the dominant trend. The formal volatilization of democracy develops just as it has become clear that, without interventions capable of affecting or in some way controlling the monopoly of intellectual production, not even minimal, democracy can be saved or achieved, and nor can the de facto reintroduction of property-based discrimination be prevented. This is particularly evident in the United States, the country in the vanguard of the reduction of democracy to a market. Here, with organized parties having been depowered and marginalized, and the mass media alone deciding the outcome of electoral competition, the most important elected offices tend to become the prerogative of great wealth or of lobbies, with the interest and ability to pay the enormous sums of money now required. The analysis proposed here seems to deny the self-evident existence of democracy in the West. But we might reflect on the fact that, historically, even authors who are far from revolutionary have sometimes expressed the awareness that property-based discrimination can manifest itself in ways other than formal and explicit exclusion from the enjoyment of political rights. In 1866, a moderate French liberal underlined how the lack of remuneration for British MPs in fact benefited only the aristocracy, which thereby controlled the representative bodies and, moreover, made itself look good by flaunting its alleged disinterest. Non-payment for parliamentary offices was a different way of excluding certain social classes from elective offices which in fact continued to be the monopoly of the richer classes. Has this monopoly disappeared, or is it disappearing today? Or are we witnessing the implementation of new instruments to perpetuate it, and even to restore it in its entirety where it had been partially broken? On the eve of the generalized collapse of property-based restrictions that followed World War I and the October Revolution, Lenin analyzed how, despite the great extension of suffrage achieved through long struggle, political institutions continue to exclude or marginalize the subaltern classes. On the one hand, there is the purely capitalist organization of the daily press. On the other, certain minute aspects of electoral legislation, which discourage the poor from active participation in democracy. 5. Enormous changes have taken place since then, albeit through a long and laborious process. The legislative norms that considerably denied political rights to blacks and poor whites in America, even past the midpoint in the 20th century, have collapsed. Equal universal suffrage has become an unshakable bottom line, hence the failure of the attempts, continuing almost up to the present, to introduce or maintain plural voting. Yet the restrictions, exceptions, exclusions, obstacles for the poor, of which Lenin speaks, have not completely gone away. We need only think, in the U.S. case, of the registration laws to which eminent American sociologists attribute an at least objective discriminatory effect. A discrimination in the last analysis based on wealth. Indeed, still in 1975, one American senator saw in these laws a disenfranchisement on a massive scale of the poorer classes. 4. This is the same context in which we should place the turn towards the single-member constituency. To quote Weber, himself a supporter of this system, this is only apparently a merely technical instrument. In fact, it has long been considered by a whole series of liberal and conservative politicians, as well as authors, as the only viable alternative to the abolition of universal suffrage, which is itself now unfeasible. All this may seem astonishing and even unheard of. However, we have seen that the single-member constituency predated the advent of universal suffrage, related as it is to a pre-modern concept of representation held by communities and guilds, rather than by individuals. Moreover, it has been thought of and theorized in opposition to universal suffrage as an instrument to continue substantially to exclude the childish multitude from political life. The latter is henceforth called upon not even really to choose between this or that plenipotentiary leader, on the basis of alternative programs and rational arguments, but merely to let itself be charmed and influenced by one or the other. From Britain, where the idea of individual representation emerged much later than elsewhere, the electoral system based on single-member constituencies then moved on to America. There, it continues to prove vitally important, and not only because of the weight of tradition behind it. First of all, it is a system that in both these countries has proved perfectly congenial to a political regime characterized by the personalization of power and uninterrupted imperial expansion, whether in colonies across the oceans or in the far west and other territories contiguous to the metropolitan core. A further consideration should be made in reference to the U.S. case. This is a country where work is largely handed off on foreigners, whether that means blacks who were first slaves and then long endured semi-servile conditions, and in any case were excluded from political rights, or immigrants, also often not admitted to political citizenship. It is also a country that, for very many decades, had at its disposal the pressure valve represented by the territories taken from the Native Americans or Mexicans. In such a context, the white community has appeared fairly homogeneous and devoid of the bitter social contradictions typical of Europe. The single-member constituency responds to this situation. It is no accident that, in the 1960s and 1970s, American political figures concerned about the spread and worsening of racial tensions proposed the introduction, at least at the level of local government, of the proportional system as an instrument to allow blacks to express themselves politically. But these proposals were rejected with the argument that the abandonment of the single-member constituency would have allowed for the election of militant or extremist elements, that is, also of blacks not fully integrated into the existing system. 5. The Los Angeles Revolt in 1992 is the other face of the rejection of the principle of proportional representation and the political decapitation of the subaltern classes. With the reduction of democracy to its most minimal market variant, no longer considered bearers of socio-economic rights, deprived of any party organization on which they could rely, with no access to media, and even kept from voting by way of registration laws. Blacks, still affected by not inconsiderable racial discrimination, are ultimately unable to make their voices heard on a more properly political level. They can protest only through recourse to a kind of urban jacquerie, an angry and destructive revolt, which, however, does nothing to change the existing state of affairs. As the example in particular of the French Fifth Republic shows, even in the 20th century, the march of Bonapartism has been marked by the triumph of the single-member constituency. Electoral legislation further multiplies the effects of the monopoly which the wealthy hold over a mass media apparatus of unprecedented power, thus accelerating and reinforcing the political decapitation of the subordinate classes. As the American model triumphs, the phenomenon of urban jacqueries, fed by immigrants, underclasses, and subaltern and marginalized social classes, is destined to repeat itself in Europe too. Indeed, this is already happening, in Britain in particular. In the last 2 centuries, the emancipation process wrested universal equal suffrage, one person, one vote, demanded proportional representation in the name of the equal representative value of each vote, challenged the monopoly, however configured and disguised, of representative bodies by wealth, connected political rights with social and economic ones, and saw and celebrated democracy as the emancipation of classes, races, and peoples held in a subaltern condition. Today, this process seems to have suffered a serious setback. In this sense, we are witnessing a phase of disemancipation. Similar such phases have marked democracy's long and tortuous path throughout its history. But as far as the current one is concerned, the end is not yet in sight.